For nearly 3,000 years, Troy did not exist. It was a place you could not go to, a city with no location, famous everywhere and standing nowhere, a name that lived only in poetry. Every educated person in the ancient and medieval and early modern world knew the story of its fall, could name its king and its hero, and the woman whose face was said to have launched the fleet against it, and none of them could have told you where it was, because by then it was generally understood that it had never been anywhere at all. Troy was a story, a magnificent one, the foundation stone of Western literature, but a story. The way the palace of the gods is a story. The way the island of the Lotus Eaters is a story. And then, in the 1870s, a wealthy German businessman with no formal training in archaeology, an obsessive who had loved the poem since he was a boy, and who insisted against all expert opinion that it described a real place, began digging into a low mound on the windswept coast of northwestern Turkey. And he found a city. He found walls and burnt layers, and beneath them older walls, and beneath those older ones still. 9 cities stacked one on top of another like the pages of a book. And in the ruins he found gold, heaped, worked, extraordinary gold, which he announced to a stunned world was the treasure of King Priam himself. The news travelled across Europe in weeks and made him famous. Newspapers carried the story. The public, which had grown up on the poem, understood immediately what was being claimed. A city everyone had filed under mythology had apparently been dug out of a Turkish hillside by a man who had simply refused to accept that it was not there. Hello, traveller. Tonight, we set out on the entire story of Troy, the city that everyone believed was a myth, the war that may or may not have happened, and the poem that has outlived every empire that ever loved it. Before we begin, take a moment, leave a like, and subscribe to the channel. But only if these journeys are truly yours. And leave a word below to say where you're listening from tonight, and the hour it is where you are. There's a quiet pleasure in seeing who else has gathered here tonight, in how many countries, under how many skies. Now, let the lights go low, let the world go quiet, and let's step into the story together. The gold, as it turned out, was not Priam's. It was 1,000 years too old for the war the poem describes, dug from a city that had risen and fallen long before any Greek ship could have beached on that shore. The man who found it, Heinrich Schliemann, had blasted a great trench straight down through the mound in his hurry to reach what he was certain lay at the bottom, and in doing so he had torn through the very layer that most likely held the Troy he was looking for, destroying, in his eagerness to prove the poem true, a good deal of the evidence that might have proved it. He was part visionary and part fabulist, and scholars have been arguing about him ever since. The arguments are not merely about temperament. Schliemann's published accounts contain claims that have not survived checking. The diaries and the books disagree with each other. The circumstances of the treasure's discovery were almost certainly rearranged for effect, including the presence of his wife, who the evidence suggests was not even in the country that day. And his habit of improving a story extended to inventing an audience with an American president and a first-hand account of a fire in San Francisco he seems not to have witnessed. None of that means he faked the finds, and there is no serious suggestion that the treasure itself was manufactured. But it means every claim he made about context, where exactly an object lay, what was found with what, has to be treated as testimony from an unreliable witness, and in archaeology context is nearly everything. He gave the world a real city and made it permanently difficult to be sure about the details of what he took out of it. But the essential thing he did could not be undone, and it changed everything. He demonstrated that there was a real city on that hill. The place in the poem was a place. It is worth pausing on how thoroughly the learned world had given up on that idea, because it makes the reversal sharper. By the early 19th century, the dominant scholarly position, particularly in Germany, was not merely that the war was legendary, but that Homer himself was a fiction. That the poems were an assemblage of shorter songs stitched together by later editors, with no single author and no historical core worth pursuing. Educated opinion held that looking for Troy was like looking for the Garden of Eden, a category error, the sort of thing an enthusiast did. Frank Calvert, the Englishman who actually identified the mound and who had far better judgment than Schliemann, could not get the British Museum interested in funding a dig. The institutions were not merely uninterested, they thought the question was not a question. And an outsider with no credentials and a great deal of money went and dug anyway, and was right. Somewhere under the grass of a Turkish headland overlooking the narrow strait where the Aegean squeezes into the sea road to the Black Sea, Troy had been standing all along. And that discovery, wonderful as it was, opened a far deeper question. The question that hangs over this whole night, and that a century and a half of excavation has still not closed. Because finding a city is not the same as finding a war. The hill at Hisarlik holds the ruins of a real and substantial Bronze Age town, wealthy, fortified, burned more than once. That much is beyond dispute. But nothing that has come out of the ground carries a name, or a date, or a line of writing that says, "Here is where Agamemnon camped, here is where Hector fell, here is what happened and why." There is no inscription. There is no Trojan archive. The city is silent about its own destruction. That silence is not unusual for the period, and it is worth understanding why. Writing in the late Bronze Age was overwhelmingly administrative, and it was done on materials chosen for convenience rather than permanence. The Hittites and the Mesopotamians wrote on clay, which survives beautifully, and survives best of all when a city burns, because fire bakes the tablets hard. That is the great irony of Bronze Age archaeology. We know about these societies largely because they were destroyed. Where a palace burned, its archive was preserved. Where a palace was peacefully abandoned, the unfired clay dissolved back into mud, and everything written in it is gone. Troy burned and produced no archive, which suggests either that the city's records were kept on something perishable. Wooden writing boards coated with wax were in use in this period and have almost entirely vanished. Or that the part of the city where records were kept has not been found, or was carted off the summit by Hellenistic builders 2,500 years ago. There is a small teasing exception. A single bronze seal, inscribed in Luwian hieroglyphs, was found at Troy in the 1990s. It bears the names of a scribe and his wife. It is the only piece of writing ever recovered from the site, and what it proves is precisely that writing was in use there, and therefore that more of it existed once, somewhere, and is lost. And so the greatest war story ever told sits on a foundation of ash and arrowheads and inference. Real enough to be maddening, incomplete enough that serious scholars still disagree, sometimes sharply, about whether the Trojan War is a distorted memory of something that actually happened, or a magnificent fiction that grew up around a city that merely happened to be there. Tonight we are going to take both halves of that puzzle seriously and give each its due. We will begin with the story as the poets told it. The whole sweep of it, from the quarrel among the goddesses to the theft of Helen, from the gathering of the black ships to the 9 long years before the walls, from the terrible wrath of Achilles to the death of Hector and the horse standing empty on the plain at dawn. We will tell it as a story, because it is one of the greatest stories our species has ever produced, and because for 3,000 years it was the only Troy anyone had. Then we will climb the real hill and walk through the actual ruins and see what the spade has found. The 9 cities stacked in the mound, the great sloping walls and the towers, the harbour that made the place rich, the layers of burning. We will read the letters. For there are letters, remarkable ones, not from Troy but about it, in the clay archives of the Hittite Empire that ruled Anatolia in those centuries, which speak of a city called Wailusa and a king called Alexandu and troublesome people from across the sea. And then, at the deep of the night, we will sit down with all of it, honestly, and weigh what can and cannot be said. Because the real story of Troy is not simply the war, it is the far stranger tale of how a memory survived. Whatever happened on that plain happened in the closing centuries of the Bronze Age, in a world of chariots and bronze swords and palace kingdoms that would shortly collapse into ruin and be forgotten for 400 years, a world that lost its writing and its cities and very nearly its history. And somehow, through those 4 centuries of darkness, with no writing at all, carried only in the memory of singers who could not read and who passed the lines from mouth to ear across a dozen generations, the story of a city by the sea survived. Until at last, in a Greece learning to write again, someone we call Homer set it down. It should not have made it. Almost nothing else did. And that is the deepest mystery of Troy, deeper even than the question of the war, not whether it fell, but how the memory of it managed not to. Before we go down onto the plain, it is worth being precise about what is actually known, because Troy is a subject where the confident claim and the honest claim are very different animals, and the honest one is more interesting. Here is what is not in dispute. There is a hill called Hisarlik on the northwestern coast of Turkey, a few kilometers from the mouth of the Dardanelles, and inside that hill are the remains of a settlement that was occupied, on and off, for something like 3,500 years. It was not a village. In its greatest phases, it was a walled town with monumental fortifications, sloping stone ramparts and towers and gates, a citadel with substantial buildings, and, as excavation over the last few decades has increasingly shown, a considerably larger lower town spreading out beyond the walls, which makes the place far more significant than the modest citadel alone once suggested. It sat in a position of real strategic value, above the plain where two rivers meet the sea, commanding the approach to the narrow strait that is the only sea road from the Aegean to the Black Sea. It was rich. It traded. It was destroyed, more than once, in ways that included burning. And in the late Bronze Age, at exactly the period the Greek tradition assigns to the war, it was a substantial fortified city that suffered a violent end. Here is what is not known. Whether any of the people in the poem existed, whether a coalition of Greek kingdoms ever besieged the place, whether a woman was taken, whether the destruction that shows in the ground was caused by an invading army from across the sea, by a local war, by an earthquake, by fire spreading through a crowded town, or by some combination that no excavation can now untangle. There is no Trojan inscription naming a war. There is no Greek record from the period describing one. The Bronze Age Greeks could write. We have thousands of their clay tablets, in the script we call Linear B. But what survives is almost entirely accountancy. Inventories of sheep and chariot wheels and rations of grain, the paperwork of palace bureaucracies, not a line of history or narrative among them. The tablets tell us how many oxen a palace held. They do not tell us who it fought. So the case for the Trojan War is entirely circumstantial, and it is worth naming exactly what the circumstances are, because they are genuinely suggestive. A real and important city stood exactly where the tradition said it did. It was destroyed by violence at approximately the right time. The archives of the Hittite Empire, which are contemporary and which do survive, mention a place in that region called Wailusa, a name that maps convincingly onto the Greek Ilios, the poem's other name for Troy, and describe it as a kingdom with a treaty relationship to the Hittite king, and they mention a troublesome maritime power called Ahiawa, a name that many scholars connect to the Achaeans, which is the poem's own word for the Greeks. There are hints, in that Hittite correspondence, of friction over Wailusa involving people from across the sea. None of this proves the war of the poem. All of it establishes that a Greek-speaking sea power and a city called something very like Ilios existed in the same world at the same time and occasionally came into conflict over it. That is not nothing. It is also not Homer. This is the detective's problem, and it will be our frame all night. We are going to hold two things at once without collapsing them into each other. The story, which is magnificent and which we will tell in full, and the evidence, which is fragmentary and which we will weigh honestly. We will not pretend that finding a burnt layer proves that Achilles dragged Hector around the walls. We will also not make the opposite mistake, the fashionable one, of dismissing the whole tradition as invention simply because it comes wrapped in gods and heroes. The truth, insofar as anyone can reach it, seems to lie in the uncomfortable middle, a real place, a real age of raiding and conflict, a real catastrophe. And then 4 centuries of singers, elaborating, compressing, inventing, gathering other wars and other heroes into one great tale, until what came down to us was less a report than a cathedral built over a grave. Somewhere under all that architecture, something happened. We will spend tonight trying to see it. To understand what may have happened at Troy, you have to understand the world it happened in. And that world is not the world of the poem. Homer sang, most likely, in the 8th century before Christ, to audiences living in small communities of a few thousand people, in a Greece that had only recently begun writing again after a long silence. The events he sang about belonged to a vanished age 400 or 500 years earlier, an age of palaces and bureaucracies and international kingship that had ended in fire long before he was born, and whose true nature he could not have known. He described it as best he could, partly from what the tradition had faithfully preserved, partly from the world in front of him, and partly from imagination. So the poem is a kind of layered fossil, with genuine Bronze Age details embedded in it like insects in amber, surrounded by the assumptions of a much later time. The real world of the Trojan War, if there was one, was the late Bronze Age. And this channel has walked that world before. It was, astonishingly for its era, an international age. From roughly 1600 to 1200 BC, the Eastern Mediterranean was knit together by trade and diplomacy on a scale that would not be matched again for centuries. Egypt at its height under the great pharaohs, the Hittite Empire ruling Anatolia from its mountain capital, Babylon and Assyria on the rivers, Cyprus supplying copper, the Levantine ports handling the traffic, and, on the far western edge of that system, half inside it and half outside, the Greeks. Kings wrote to one another as brothers, exchanged gifts and daughters and complaints, argued over shipments of gold. Bronze itself demanded the network, copper from one region and tin from somewhere else entirely, sometimes thousands of kilometers away, had to meet in the same workshop to make a single sword. Nobody could arm themselves alone, and the diplomacy that held it together was surprisingly personal. The letters that survived between these courts read less like state papers than like the correspondence of a quarrelsome extended family. A king complains that the gold his brother monarch sent turned out to be poor quality when it was melted down. Another is offended that his messenger was kept waiting. There are negotiations over marriages, condolences on deaths, requests for physicians and craftsmen to be lent between courts, and long passages of elaborate courtesy that everyone involved understood as the price of doing business. It is a recognizable world of international relations, conducted in cuneiform on clay, 3,300 years ago. The Greeks of that age we call Mycenaeans, after the greatest of their citadels. They were not the Greeks of the classical world. No philosophers, no democracy, no marble temples. That lay 700 years in the future. They were something harder and stranger. A warrior society of small, fiercely fortified palace kingdoms scattered across the mainland and the islands, each ruled from a citadel of colossal stone blocks so massive that later Greeks, unable to imagine human beings lifting them, said giants must have built the walls. Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, Thebes. Their kings were buried with gold masks and inlaid daggers. Walk into Mycenae today, and the scale of it still lands. You come up to a gate flanked by walls of unworked boulders so large that the classical Greeks, who could build the Parthenon, assumed the Cyclopes had stacked them. And above the lintel, carved in relief, 2 lionesses facing a column, the oldest monumental sculpture in Europe. Inside, cut into the slope, are the shaft graves where Schliemann found his second great treasure. Gold death masks beaten thin and laid over the faces of dead men, daggers inlaid in gold and silver with hunting scenes, drinking vessels, weapons, jewelry. He sent his famous telegram claiming he had gazed upon the face of Agamemnon, and he was wrong again. Those graves are 3 centuries too early for any Trojan war. But the point stands. These were rich, warlike, ambitious little kingdoms, ruled by men who wanted to be buried in gold. And near the citadel stand the great beehive tombs, corbelled stone domes big enough to stand in, built with an engineering confidence that would not be matched in Europe for 1,000 years after their builders were gone. Their palaces ran on writing and inventory, kept warehouses of oil and grain and weapons, and employed scribes to count everything. They were also, unmistakably, raiders. They traded across the sea when trading paid, and they took what they could when taking paid better. And the line between merchant and pirate in that world was not one anybody spent much time drawing. If a coalition of such kings ever did sail east to attack a rich city on the Anatolian coast, they would not have needed a stolen queen as a reason. Troy sat on the strait, and Troy was wealthy, and that has always been reason enough. And on the other side of the water stood the city itself, in a landscape worth picturing clearly, because it shaped everything that happened there. Troy stood on a low ridge at the edge of a wide plain, with 2 rivers winding across the flats below, and the sea a short ride to the west and north. Behind it, inland, rose the wooded slopes of Mount Ida. In front of it lay the Dardanelles. That long, narrow, current-swept channel through which every ship bound for the Black Sea and the grain and gold and horses of the north had to pass, and through which, for much of the sailing season, the prevailing wind blows steadily and stubbornly south, straight into the face of anyone trying to sail up it. Ships waited, sometimes for weeks, and a city standing precisely at the mouth of that bottleneck, with a sheltered bay and a plain where crews could camp and animals could graze, was in a position to grow very rich indeed on other people's delays. And there is a detail in the excavation that fits this so neatly it is almost suspicious. Among the most common finds at Troy are spindle hauls and loom weights, the equipment of textile production, in numbers far beyond what a town of that size would need for its own clothing. Something like 100,000 of them have been recovered over the history of the digging. That is industrial-scale cloth production for a Bronze Age settlement, and cloth was one of the great trade goods of the age, valuable, portable, and endlessly in demand. Picture what that means in practice. A city where a large part of the population spends its days spinning and weaving, and a harbour full of ships that cannot leave, whose crews have silver and time and a long voyage ahead of them. The wind that trapped the ships fed the looms. That is the true foundation of Troy. Not a beautiful woman, but a wind that would not change, and a strait that could not be avoided. Now leave the evidence behind for a while, and let the story have the night. Because for 3,000 years this was Troy. Not a mound in Turkey, but a tale told aloud, and it is a tale worth hearing whole in the order the poets gave it. Later we will come back and ask what any of it means. For now, simply let it unfold. It begins, the tradition says, at a wedding. The marriage of a mortal man to a sea goddess, attended by every deity of the Greek world except one. The goddess of discord had not been invited, for the obvious reason, and she came anyway, and she brought a gift, a golden apple, inscribed with 3 words that were less a compliment than a trap. For the fairest, 3 goddesses claimed it: the queen of the gods, the goddess of wisdom and war, and the goddess of love. And because no god was foolish enough to judge between them, the choice was pushed downward onto a mortal. He was a prince of Troy named Paris, a king's son who had been raised for a time among the herdsmen on the slopes of Mount Ida, and it was there, among the sheep, that the 3 most powerful goddesses in the world came to him and asked him to choose. Each of them offered him a bribe, and the bribes tell you what the ancient world thought a man might want. The queen of the gods offered him power, rule over kingdoms, the lordship of Asia. The goddess of wisdom offered him victory, unbeatable skill in war, the glory that never fades. And the goddess of love offered him the most beautiful woman alive. He chose the woman. It is the hinge on which everything turns, and the poets never let you forget it. One young man, on a hillside, choosing desire over power and over glory, and by that choice condemning his city, his family, and himself. And there is a detail in the older versions that makes the choice worse. Paris was not simply a prince who happened to be out among the flocks. He had been born to Priam and Hecuba, and before his birth his mother dreamed that she gave birth to a burning torch that set the whole city alight, and the seers who interpreted the dream said plainly that this child would be the destruction of Troy. So the infant was taken out and exposed on the mountain to die, and did not die, because a herdsman found him and raised him, as happens in every story of this kind. He grew up strong and beautiful among the shepherds, and came back to the city as a young man, and was recognized and joyfully received back into the royal family that had ordered his death. Which means that everything in the story, from the apple to the ashes, is the working out of a prophecy that his parents tried to prevent and could not, and that the city welcomed its own destruction home with open arms because it was handsome and it was theirs. 2 goddesses went away from that hillside as enemies of Troy, and they did not forget. The trouble was that the most beautiful woman alive was already married. Her name was Helen, and she was the wife of Menelaus, king of Sparta, and her hand had been contested by so many powerful suitors that, before the marriage, an oath had been extracted from all of them. Whoever won her, the rest would defend that marriage if it were ever violated. It was meant to prevent a war. It guaranteed one. When Paris came to Sparta as a guest, and was received in the king's own house with all the sacred courtesy owed to a guest, and then left with the king's wife and a great deal of the king's treasure, he did not merely commit a theft or a seduction. He broke the deepest social law the Greek world had, the bond between host and guest that the gods themselves were said to enforce. And he activated an oath that bound every major king in Greece to sail against his city. Whether Helen went willingly is a question the ancient world itself could never settle, and the sources contradict one another with a kind of embarrassment. Some tell of abduction, some of love, some of divine compulsion so overwhelming that no human choice was involved at all. And one strange and beautiful tradition holds that she never went to Troy at all, that only a phantom of her stood on the walls while the real Helen waited out the war in Egypt, and that the whole 10 years of slaughter was fought over an image. Homer himself, remarkably, gives Helen a voice, and what she says is neither romantic nor defiant. She is bitter and ashamed and lonely, and she speaks of herself with a self-loathing that is startling in a poem of heroes. She is the most famous woman in literature, and one of the saddest. And the tradition never resolved what to do with her, which is itself revealing. In the Iliad, she is a real person with an inner life, weaving a great cloth on which she is embroidering the battles being fought over her. An image of a woman making art out of her own catastrophe that has haunted readers for 3,000 years. In the tragedies, she is variously a monster, a victim, and a survivor who talks her way out of execution. In the Odyssey, remarkably, she is home in Sparta, back with Menelaus, hosting guests with perfect composure and drugging the wine to keep everyone from crying about the war, as though the whole thing were a difficult episode that has been tidied away. Some poets blamed her absolutely. Others insisted she was innocent, compelled, or never there. A Greek lyric poet was said to have been struck blind for slandering her and to have recovered his sight only after writing a recantation declaring she never went to Troy at all. She is a screen onto which the tradition projected its confusion about desire, blame, and war, and it never arrived at a verdict. What Homer gives her, uniquely, is self-knowledge. Even the phrase everyone knows about her, the face that launched 1,000 ships, is not Homer at all. It comes from an English play of the 1590s, more than 2,000 years later, in which a magician conjures her shade and speaks that line before kissing it. That is the level of accretion involved. The single most quoted sentence about the most famous woman in ancient literature was written by an Elizabethan dramatist, and nearly everyone who uses it assumes it is Greek. What Homer gives her, uniquely, is self-knowledge. She says she wishes she had died before it began, calls herself hateful, and knows exactly what she has been made into. That is a strange and generous thing for a poem written by the winners to give to the woman they used as their excuse. The oath was called in, and Greece went to war. And the gathering of that army is the moment the story swells from a domestic crime into something vast. Kings came from every corner of the Mycenaean world, each with his ships and his men, and Homer devotes a long, strange, magnificent passage to naming them. Contingent after contingent, island after island, a roll call of places and captains that scholars have pored over for centuries because it seems, in its geography, to preserve a genuine map of the Bronze Age Greek world rather than the world of Homer's own day. 1,000 ships, the tradition says, though the number is poetry rather than arithmetic. It was, in the story, the largest force the Greek world had ever assembled, and it was commanded by the most powerful king among them, Agamemnon of Mycenae, brother of the wronged husband, a man the poem treats with remarkably little affection. That coldness toward the commander-in-chief is one of the poem's sharpest instincts. Agamemnon is not a villain. He is something more recognizable and more irritating. A man whose authority exceeds his judgment. He is proud, easily offended, prone to catastrophic decisions made in temper, and then to elaborate self-justification afterward, and his own troops mutter about him. In one famous scene, an ordinary soldier stands up in the assembly and says out loud what the rank and file evidently think, that the kings have grown rich on plunder while the men do the dying, and that they should all take the ships and go home. And he is beaten with a staff for it by Odysseus while the army laughs. It is an ugly little episode, and it is left in, unsoftened. The poem is aristocratic, and it knows perfectly well what the men at the bottom of the army think of the men at the top. Among the captains were the figures who would become the permanent furniture of Western imagination. Odysseus of Ithaca, the cleverest man alive, who did not want to go, and who tried, the later stories say, to feign madness to avoid it, and who would spend 10 years fighting and another 10 trying to get home. Great Ajax, enormous and stubborn, who carried a shield like a tower. Nestor, the old king, full of advice and reminiscence, the voice of a generation already passing. Diomedes, young and terrifying. And above all, Achilles, son of a mortal father and a sea goddess mother, the greatest fighter who ever lived, who came to Troy knowing, because his mother had told him, that he faced a choice between two fates, a long, quiet, forgotten life at home, or a short life at Troy and a name that would never die. He chose the name. The whole poem is, in a sense, an examination of what that choice actually costs. They sailed, and they came to the plain below the city, and they beached their ships in the long lines that would be their home for a decade, and they built a camp with a wall and a ditch, and they settled in to take Troy, and they could not take it. That is the thing the popular memory of the story tends to skip, and it matters enormously. The war, in the tradition, lasts 10 years, and for 9 of them essentially nothing decisive happens. The walls hold. The Greeks cannot get in, the Trojans cannot drive them off, so the war becomes something grinding and unglamorous. Raids up and down the coast for plunder and food, the sacking of smaller towns in the region, cattle taken, captives taken, seasons turning, men growing older in a camp beside a beach far from home, dying of wounds and of sickness, burying their friends in a foreign plain. The Greek army is not besieging Troy so much as living beside it. Long before the poem's action begins, the war has become a way of life, and a miserable one. And inside the walls, the city lives too. This is the other thing the story does that no earlier war tale had done. It goes inside. Troy is not a faceless enemy fortress. It has an old king, Priam, and a queen, Hecuba, and 50 sons, and streets, and temples, and women at their looms, and a small boy who is frightened of his father's war helmet. That scene is worth having in full, because it is the one that most readers carry with them for the rest of their lives. Hector comes back into the city during a lull in the fighting, and looks for his wife, and does not find her at home. She has gone up to the tower on the wall because she heard the Trojans were being pushed back, and she is standing there watching the plain with the nurse beside her carrying their baby son. They meet at the gate, and Andromache takes his hand and says the thing that everyone in her position has always said, and that the poem lets her say without softening any of it, that his own courage will destroy him, that he has no pity for his infant son or for her, that she has no father and no mother and no brothers left. Achilles killed them all when he sacked her home city, and that Hector is now father and mother and brother and husband to her, all at once, and that if he dies there is nothing left for her but slavery. Stay on the wall, she says. Fight from here. Do not make your child an orphan and your wife a widow. And Hector answers that he cannot, that he would be ashamed before the men and women of Troy if he hung back like a coward, that he has learned to be always among the first, and that he knows. He says it plainly, that the day is coming when sacred Troy will fall and Priam will die and all his people with him, and that what troubles him most in all of that is not his father or his mother or his brothers, but the thought of her led away, weeping into slavery by some Greek, and someone saying, "There goes the wife of Hector, who was the best of the Trojans." Then he reaches for the baby, and the child screams and turns away, terrified by the bronze helmet and the horsehair crest nodding above it. And both parents laugh. Hector takes the helmet off and sets it shining on the ground and picks up his son and kisses him and prays that the boy may grow up to be better than his father, and that men may one day say of him, he is far better than his father was, as he comes home from the war carrying the bloody spoils. Then he gives the child back to his wife, and she takes him and holds him to her breast, laughing through tears. And Hector puts his helmet back on and goes out to the plain. It is worth saying what makes that scene work, because it is not sentiment. Homer knows, and the audience knows, and Hector himself says out loud that every single thing Andromache fears is going to happen. The city will fall. He will die. She will be taken. The child in his arms will not grow up. And knowing all of it, the poet still gives them the laugh over the helmet. A small domestic joke between two people in a doorway, with the worst thing in the world coming toward them. That is the technique of the entire poem in miniature. Absolute clarity about the ending, and complete attention to the ordinary human moment happening in front of it. It has Hector, the eldest son, the city's champion, a man of duty rather than glory, who fights not because he wants a name, but because his family and his city stand behind him and there is no one else. Homer gives the enemy the tenderest scenes in the poem. That decision, made 3,000 years ago by a poet, or a tradition of poets in a warrior culture that had every reason to do otherwise, is one of the reasons the story never died. There is a scene early in the Iliad that shows exactly how far the poem is willing to go with that. The two armies, exhausted after 9 years, agree to settle the whole thing with a single duel between the two men most directly concerned: Menelaus, the wronged husband, and Paris, who took his wife. It is the obvious solution, and it should have ended the war in an afternoon. And while they arm, the poet takes us up onto the walls of Troy, where the old men of the city sit watching, and where Helen comes to stand beside King Priam. The old men see her and murmur that it is no wonder men have fought so long over such a woman, and then add, immediately, that all the same she should be sent back before she destroys them all. And Priam, whose city is being ruined because of her, does not reproach her. He calls her his dear child and tells her he does not blame her, that he blames the gods, and then asks her to name the Greek captains for him, one by one, as they take the field. So the poem gives us this: an old man and the woman who has cost him everything, sitting together on the wall in the sunshine, talking quietly about the enemy below, with real tenderness between them. And Helen names the men she once knew, and looks for her 2 brothers among them, and cannot find them, and wonders whether they stayed home out of shame for her. And the poet tells us, in an aside of shattering quietness, that they were not there because they were already dead and buried in their own country, and she did not know. The Iliad, the poem itself, the one that survives, does not tell the whole war. This surprises people who come to it expecting the story they half remember. There is no golden apple in it, no abduction of Helen, no wooden horse, no fall of the city. Homer assumes his audience knows all that. Those events lived in other poems and other tellings, most of them now lost. What the Iliad covers is a span of about 7 weeks in the 10th and final year, and its subject is announced in its very first word: not war, not Troy, wrath. The anger of one man and what it costs. It begins with a quarrel over dishonor. Agamemnon, the commander, is forced by circumstance to give up a captive woman he has taken as a prize, and to compensate himself he takes another prize instead, one that belongs to Achilles. In a world where a warrior's entire worth is measured publicly in the honors his peers grant him, this is not a squabble over property. It is a deliberate humiliation of the best fighter in the army by the man who leads it, in front of everyone. And Achilles, who has spent 9 years fighting a war that was never his quarrel, in a country not his own, for a king he does not respect, simply stops. He withdraws to his ships and refuses to fight, and asks his goddess mother to petition the king of the gods that the Greeks be driven back and slaughtered until they understand what they have lost in him. And it is granted. What follows is the poem's long, terrible middle. The Greeks, without Achilles, are pushed back across the plain, day after day. The Trojans, led by Hector, drive them to their own camp, then to the ditch, then to the wall, and finally to the ships themselves, where fire begins to take hold in the hulls that are their only way home. Embassies are sent to Achilles offering restitution, treasure, women, land, anything. And in one of the greatest speeches in all literature, he refuses them all, and says something that no hero in that culture was supposed to say: that no amount of cattle or tripods or gold is worth a man's life, that his mother told him he could go home and live, and that fame is not obviously worth dying for. For a moment, the entire heroic code that the poem exists to celebrate is held up and found hollow. Then the story closes over him again. The speech is worth dwelling on because of what it costs the poem to include it. 3 men come to Achilles' shelter at night with Agamemnon's offer, and the offer is enormous. Tripods, gold, horses, women, 7 cities, the return of the girl untouched, one of the king's own daughters in marriage. In the value system of that world, it is complete restitution and more. And Achilles refuses it, and the reason he gives is not that the offer is too small, but that the whole exchange is meaningless. The same portion comes to the man who holds back and the man who fights hard, he says. The coward and the hero die alike. Cattle and fat sheep can be raided, tripods and horses can be bought, but a man's life does not come back once it has passed the barrier of his teeth. And then he tells them what his mother told him, that he carries two fates toward the day of his death, and that if he stays and fights at Troy, he loses his homecoming, but his glory will never die, and that if he goes home, he loses that glory, but will live long. And he says, in front of the embassy, that he is going home. He does not, in the end. But the poem has let him say it, has let its greatest hero stand up in the middle of the war and state that the entire structure of honor that the war runs on is not worth the price, and has given him the best lines in the book to say it with. No other heroic literature in the ancient world does anything remotely like that. The thing that finally moves him is not honor and not the army. It is love. Patroclus, his dearest companion since childhood, cannot bear to watch the Greeks burn, and begs to be allowed to enter the battle wearing Achilles' own armor, so that the Trojans will believe the great fighter has returned. Achilles consents, with conditions, and the conditions are ignored, as they always are. Patroclus drives the Trojans back from the ships, and is carried away by his own success, and goes too far, and meets Hector. And Hector kills him, and strips the borrowed armor from his body. And then the wrath that has held the poem in place turns, and becomes something far worse. Achilles' grief is enormous and frightening, and it curdles instantly into a single purpose. He knows what it means. His mother tells him plainly that his own death follows close behind Hector's, and he does not care. He returns to the field in new armor made by a god, and what follows is the most terrifying sequence in ancient literature, a man beyond reason moving across a battlefield. And the poet does something extraordinary before he lets him go. Achilles' old armor is lost. Hector is wearing it, so his mother goes to the smith god to have new armor made, and Homer stops the entire war for several hundred lines to describe the shield. It is a rounded metal disc, and the god works the whole world onto it in concentric bands, the earth and the sky and the sea, the sun and the moon and the constellations. 2 cities. In the first, a wedding is taking place, with torches and dancing and singing, and elsewhere in the same city a legal dispute is being argued before the elders in the marketplace, with the crowd taking sides and a fee laid down for whoever judges best. A city at peace, settling its quarrels with words. The second city is under siege, with an army camped outside and an ambush laid by the river and men killing each other over cattle. And then, around them both, the ordinary year, ploughing, and the harvest with a king standing silent and glad among his reapers, and a vineyard with young people carrying grapes in baskets while a boy plays a lyre, and cattle going out to pasture and being attacked by lions, and sheep in a valley, and a dancing floor where young men and women hold each other by the wrist and turn in a ring while a crowd watches. All of it, the whole of human life, hammered onto a shield that is about to be carried into the worst killing in the poem. Nobody has ever fully explained why Homer does this, and nobody who has read it forgets it. At the exact moment the story narrows to one man's rage, the poet opens the frame as wide as it will go and shows you everything that rage is not. The Trojans are swept back to their gates, and Hector, who could have gone inside with them, who is begged from the walls by his father and his mother to come in, stays out, because he was the one who insisted on fighting in the open, because the disaster is his responsibility, and because he cannot bear the shame of surviving it. He waits. Then, when Achilles comes on, he runs 3 times around the walls of his own city, before he turns and faces him and dies. And the poem still is not finished, because Homer's real subject is not the killing. It is what comes after. Achilles, in his grief, refuses to release Hector's body and abuses it day after day, and no amount of vengeance closes the hole in him. The war goes on, and nothing is healed. And then, in the last book, the old king Priam does the bravest thing in the poem. He goes, alone, at night, across the plain and into the enemy camp, and into the shelter of the man who killed his son, and kneels, and kisses the hands that did it, and asks for the body back. And the 2 of them, the old man who has lost his son, and the young man who has lost his friend and knows he is about to lose his life, sit together and weep, each for his own dead, and eat a meal together, and Achilles gives the body back. That is where the Iliad ends, not with a victory, with the funeral of Hector, tamer of horses, in the city that is about to fall. Everything that happens after that belongs to other poems, the ones that did not survive whole, and to the retellings of later centuries. The Roman poet Virgil, above all, who gave the fall of Troy its most famous form 700 years later, writing for an empire that claimed descent from the survivors. But the tradition is consistent in its outline, and it is where the story arrives at the image everyone remembers. Achilles dies, as he knew he would, before the city falls. Struck, the tradition says, in the one place where he could be harmed, by an arrow shot by Paris, the man whose choice began it all. The greatest warrior in the world is killed by the least warlike prince in the story, and the poets clearly relished the irony. Paris dies too, before the end. The war grinds on, and the walls still hold, because the walls always held. 10 years of the finest army in the Greek world had proved one thing beyond doubt: Troy could not be taken by force. So it was taken by a trick, and the trick was Odysseus's. The Greeks built a horse, an enormous wooden figure, hollow, large enough to conceal a picked group of men, and left it standing on the plain, and burned their camp, and sailed their fleet away over the horizon to wait behind a nearby island. The Trojans woke to an empty shore and a monstrous offering, and the argument that followed is one the story dwells on because the city was warned. A priest told them not to trust it. Cassandra, the king's daughter, cursed with true prophecy that no one would ever believe, told them exactly what would happen. They were shown the truth and could not receive it. Virgil's account gives the moment its full horror. The Trojans come out to the empty beach and stand around the thing arguing. Some saying burn it, some saying drag it in, the city divided in the sunshine over a wooden object. And a priest of Neptune named Laocoon comes running down from the citadel and hurls a spear into the horse's flank, and the hollow belly booms, and every man there hears it and does nothing about it. Then a single Greek is dragged out of hiding in the reeds, apparently a deserter, weeping and terrified, and he tells them a story, that the Greeks have abandoned him to be sacrificed, that the horse is an offering to the goddess, and that it was built deliberately too large to fit through the gates so that the Trojans could not take it in and win her favor. It is exactly the right lie, because it turns the thing into a prize and their caution into a mistake, and they swallow it whole. And as they hesitate, 2 enormous serpents come in from the sea and take Laocoon and his sons, and the city reads this as divine judgment on the man who doubted the horse, which is the cruelest turn in the whole tradition. The truth-teller destroyed in a way that makes his warning look like blasphemy. So they breach their own wall to bring it in, because it will not fit through the gate, and they garland it, and they sing, and Cassandra screams what is going to happen, and is ignored as she always is. 4 times, Virgil says, the horse stopped on the threshold, and 4 times the armor inside it clanged, and nobody listened. They pulled it up the hill themselves. That is the real horror of the horse, and the reason it has never stopped being a metaphor. The disaster was not hidden. It stood in plain sight, enormous, and they brought it in themselves, and celebrated, and fell asleep. What happened that night is described by the ancient poets in detail, and it is enough to say here that it was the ruin of a city, and that the tradition does not treat it as a triumph. The men in the horse came out in the dark and opened the gates, and the fleet had already returned. Priam was killed at his own altar. The temples were looted, and the sanctity of the gods was violated in ways that the story insists the gods themselves punished, because almost none of the Greek leaders got home safely, and the ones who did, in many cases, found ruin waiting. Agamemnon was murdered on his return. Odysseus wandered 10 years. The victory poisoned the victors. The women of the city were taken away into slavery, and the later Greek dramatists, writing in the full confidence of their own imperial age, would return again and again to those women. The queen, Hecuba, Hector's widow, Andromache, Cassandra, and give them the stage, and let them speak, and make of the sack of Troy one of the most unsparing indictments of war that any culture has ever produced about, a victory it claimed as its own. The most extraordinary of those plays was staged in Athens in 415 BC, and its timing was not an accident. Euripides put on the Trojan women in the spring following the winter in which Athens had captured the small neutral island of Melos, killed its men, and sold its women and children into slavery for refusing to join the Athenian alliance. The play contains no Greek heroes worth the name. It is set on the smoking shore beneath the ruined city, among the surviving women of Troy, as they wait to learn which Greek captain has been allotted which of them, and it consists almost entirely of their grief. The old queen Hecuba, who has lost husband, sons, and city. Cassandra, whose prophecies no one believes, going to her fate half mad. Andromache, Hector's widow, waiting with her small son, and Helen, arguing for her life. There is no relief in it, and no redemption at the end. It was performed in a theatre full of the citizens whose assembly had voted for Melos, at a festival of their own city, by a playwright they continued to honor. Whatever else the Greeks were, they were capable of that. Of taking the founding triumph of their own tradition and staging it, in public, from the losing side, as an atrocity. There is one moment in that play that has never lost its force. Andromache, Hector's widow, is waiting on the shore with her small son when the Greek herald comes with the army's decision about the child. He is the son of Hector, and the Greeks have decided they cannot let the boy grow up. What follows is not staged as spectacle. The horror is entirely in the mother's speech and in the herald's evident shame at delivering the order, and the play simply lets it stand. It is the most unbearable scene in Greek drama, and it exists because a playwright wanted an audience of citizens who had recently voted to do something comparable to a real island to sit in daylight and hear it said aloud. The Athenians gave the play second prize. Nor was that play alone. Aeschylus put the returning Agamemnon on stage to be murdered in his own house by his wife, who had her reasons. He had sacrificed their daughter to get a favorable wind for the fleet on the way out. Sophocles took Ajax, the great bull-headed warrior, and showed him going mad with humiliation after the dead Achilles' armor was awarded to Odysseus instead of him, slaughtering a herd of animals in the belief that they were his commanders. And then, when the madness clears and he understands what he has done, taking his own life on the shore. Euripides returned to the material again and again, always with the same cold eye. The Greek theatre used the Trojan cycle as its central subject for a century and a half, and almost never used it to celebrate. It used it to ask what victory costs, what leaders owe, what happens to the defeated, and whether the gods are just. The story was their national epic, and they treated it as a permanent open wound. And that habit of turning the national story against itself may be the most valuable single thing the Greeks handed on. Most cultures produce founding epics, and almost all of them are triumphal. What the Greek tradition did with Troy, celebrating it, then interrogating it, then staging it from the enemy's side, then using it to indict its own city's conduct while that conduct was still fresh, established the possibility that a society's central story could also be the instrument of its self-criticism. Every later literature that has questioned its own wars is working in a tradition that begins on that plane. And then the fire took it. The city on the ridge above the plain burned through the night, and the smoke went up over the strait, and in the morning there was nothing on the hill but heat and ash and fallen stone. The survivors scattered. Some, the Roman tradition would insist, sailing west under a prince named Aeneas to found, eventually, another city that would swallow the world. The Greeks went home to their own catastrophes, and the plain was left empty, with a ruin standing over it, and the wind coming off the water as it always had. The tradition did not stop at the burning. It had a second great subject, and in some ways a stranger one: what happened to the winners. The Greeks called these stories the nostoi, the returns, and they form a whole cycle of their own, most of it now lost. The pattern is consistent, and it is bleak. Almost nobody gets home cleanly. The fleet is scattered by storms on the way back. Divine punishment, the poets say, for the sacrileges committed during the sack, the temples looted and the suppliants dragged from altars. Ships are wrecked. Men drown within sight of their own coasts. One captain, boasting that he had survived in spite of the gods, is killed by the sea for saying it. Others are blown to the far edges of the world and spend years finding their way back. And the ones who reach home find that home has moved on without them. Agamemnon, the great king, the commander of the whole expedition, sails into his own harbour in triumph after 10 years and is murdered within the day. Killed in his own house by his wife and her lover in a plot that Greek tragedy would return to for centuries. His wife had her reasons. To get a favourable wind for the fleet on the way out, he had sacrificed their daughter. The war that began with a stolen wife ends with a murdered husband, and the house of the victorious king dissolves into a generational cycle of vengeance that takes 3 more plays to resolve. And then there is Odysseus, whose return became the second great poem and the most famous journey in literature. He takes 10 years to sail home from Troy, 10 years on a voyage that should have taken weeks, and the poem of his wandering is a completely different kind of story from the Iliad. No armies, no siege, one man alone, moving through a world of monsters and enchantresses and impossible islands, losing every companion he started with, being offered immortality and refusing it because what he wants is his own rocky island and his aging wife and his own hearth. He is shipwrecked, imprisoned, blinded a giant, sailed past singing creatures lashed to his own mast, and gone down to the land of the dead to speak with the shades, where he meets Achilles, who tells him that he would rather be a landless labourer alive on the earth than king over all the perished dead. The greatest hero of the war, given a chance to speak from beyond it, says that the glory was not worth it after all. And when Odysseus finally reaches Ithaca, 20 years after he left it, he arrives alone, in rags, unrecognized, into a house full of men eating his substance and courting his wife. His son has grown up without ever seeing him. His old dog recognizes him and dies. His nurse knows him by a scar. And his wife, who has kept the house for 20 years by cunning of her own, does not believe him even when he stands in front of her and tests him with a question about their marriage bed that only her husband could answer. And only then, in one of the most quietly devastating recognitions in literature, does she let herself believe that the war is finally over. That is what the tradition did with its own victory. It sent the winners home to disaster and gave its second epic not to conquest but to a man trying to get back to an ordinary life and finding that 20 years had passed. Whatever else the Greeks inherited from Troy, they did not inherit a triumphalist story. The story has been told now, in its own shape, the way it was told for 3,000 years before anyone thought to go and dig. Before we climb the real hill and see what is actually there, the story pauses and rests a while on the empty plain in the quiet that comes after. It is early morning on the coast of Anatolia, and the war is over, and everyone has gone. The ships are gone from the long beach where they lay for 10 years, and the marks of their keels are already softening in the sand. The camp is gone, the ditch filling slowly with blown earth, the ash of the burned huts scattering, the tracks of thousands of feet fading under the grass that is coming back over the churned ground. The plain is wide and pale and empty in the early light, with the 2 rivers threading across it toward the sea, and the reeds along the banks moving all together when the wind comes through. And the wind does come, as it always does here, steady off the water, cool in the morning, carrying the smell of salt and wet earth and the faint bitterness of old smoke. It moves across the flats and up the slope where the city stood, and there is nothing left up there now to break it. Only fallen stone and the black scar of the burning, cooling under the sky and the gulls going over. The great walls that held for 10 years are broken open, and the light comes through the gaps and lies in long bars on the ground inside, where the streets were. Grass is already finding the cracks. It always does, and quickly. Out on the strait, the water moves the way it has always moved, the current running steadily down from the north, the surface catching the early sun in long silver ridges. A single ship is making its way up the channel, sail slack, oars working slowly against the flow. Someone's cargo going north, as cargo went north before the war and would go north for the next 3,000 years, indifferent to whose city stood on the headland or whether any city stood there at all. The world goes on almost immediately. That is the strange, level truth that comes after every catastrophe. The wind does not change, the current does not slow, the grass comes back, and the ships keep going up the strait. Down on the shore, where the fleet lay for so long, the tide has been working at the ridges, the hulls left in the sand, and by midsummer there will be nothing to show that 1,000 ships were ever drawn up there. A few charred timbers stick out of the dune grass, somebody's sandal, half buried, the bones of the animals that fed an army, scattered and bleaching. Crabs move sideways through the shallows where men used to wash. Further along, where the 2 rivers come down to the sea, the marsh birds have come back to the reed beds now that the noise has stopped, and there are hundreds of them, wading in the shallows in the early light, entirely unconcerned. There is a great quiet in that thought, and a great rest in it too. Everything that happened here, the 10 years, the anger, the ships drawn up on the sand, the man running 3 times around the walls, the old king kneeling in the enemy's shelter at midnight, all of it, whether it happened once or never happened at all, has passed into the same stillness that is over the plain this morning. Rest here a while in that stillness, in the pale early light, with the reeds moving and the gulls going over and the ruin cooling on the hill. The war is over. The wind is off the water. And under the grass, in the layers of ash and fallen stone, the city is beginning the 3,000 years of sleep from which, one day, a man with a shovel and a copy of a poem will wake it. Out past the river mouths, the sea is coming awake in the way it does, the colour moving from lead to pewter to a pale blue-green as the light strengthens, and a line of pelicans goes along the shore in single file, very low, almost touching the water. Somewhere inland a dog is barking at nothing. The reeds along the channel have their morning stillness on them, every stem holding its bead of dew, and the light comes through them sideways and turns the whole bank silver for about 10 minutes and then moves on. Rest here a while in that, on the empty plain, in the early quiet, before the digging starts. Now climb the real hill. It is not much to look at from a distance. A low, flat-topped rise at the western end of a ridge, perhaps 30 meters above the plain, covered in scrub and grass, the sort of feature you would drive past without a second glance. Its Turkish name is Hisarlik, which means, roughly, place of fortresses, and that name is itself a piece of evidence. The local people had a word for it, and the word remembered that something had been up there. What is inside the mound is the important thing, and it takes a moment to grasp. A settlement that is occupied for a very long time does not stay level. Mud brick buildings collapse or burn, and rather than clearing the debris away, people flatten it and build on top. Do that for 3,000 years and the ground itself rises, layer on layer, each city sitting on the rubble of the one before, until the whole settlement is standing on a hill made of its own past. Hisarlik is such a mound, and excavation has found in it 9 principal cities, numbered from the bottom up, each with sub-phases of its own. Troy I at the base, founded around 3000 BC, up through Troy IX, the Greek and Roman town that stood there in classical times, when tourists already came to see the site because they believed the poem. This is why the digging has been so difficult and so contentious. To reach an early layer, you must remove the later ones, which means destroying them. Every excavator must choose what to sacrifice. And the layers themselves are not neat. They tilt and interleave and were cut into by later builders who dug their own foundations down through older floors. A century and a half of work by several generations of archaeologists. The German amateur who started it, the careful American who followed decades later, the modern international teams still at work with methods no earlier digger could have dreamed of, has produced a stratigraphy that is now reasonably well understood, but every phase of that work was arguing with the phase before. It is worth knowing the sequence of those diggers, because each one changed the picture. Schliemann came first, in the 1870s and 80s, and dug the Great Trench. Then Wilhelm Dörpfeld, a trained architect who had worked with Schliemann and who took over after his death, and who did something Schliemann had not. He worked out the stratigraphy properly, identified the Great Walls of Troy VI, and argued, correctly, as it turned out, that the Homeric city lay far higher in the mound than his old employer had believed. Then, in the 1930s, the American Carl Blegen, whose excavation was meticulous by the standards of any era and whose published reports are still the foundation of the subject. It was Blegen who focused attention on Troy Vitia, the crowded phase with the buried storage jars, and who argued that this, not the grander city before it, was the Troy that fell. And then, from 1988 until his death in 2005, the German archaeologist Manfred Kaufmann, whose international team brought geophysics and modern survey to the site, and found the thing that transformed the argument. The lower town, with its rock-cut defensive ditch, spreading well beyond the citadel and implying a settlement many times larger than anyone had assumed. That last discovery set off the fiercest academic quarrel the site has seen in modern times. Kaufman argued that Troy was a substantial trading city of real regional importance, plausibly the Wilusa of the Hittite texts, plausibly worth fighting over. A colleague at another German university, the historian Frank Kolb, attacked the interpretation with considerable heat, arguing that the lower town was being oversold, that the site was a modest local fortress rather than a great commercial center, and that the whole reconstruction owed more to Homeric enthusiasm than to evidence. The dispute became public and unusually bitter, complete with a formal symposium convened to adjudicate it. The general verdict since has leaned toward Kaufman on the substance. The lower town is real, and the city was larger than Blegen thought, while conceding that the strongest claims about Troy as a great emporium go beyond what the finds can carry. Kaufman's team also found something else that changed the practical picture, evidence bearing on where the sea actually was. The coastline has moved enormously since the Bronze Age because the two rivers have been dumping silt into the bay for 3,000 years and have pushed the shore several kilometers out. Geological coring has reconstructed the ancient bay, and it turns out that in the late Bronze Age the water came in much closer to the city than it does now. That the plain the poem describes, with the ships drawn up and the camp between the fleet and the walls, was a good deal smaller than the flat expanse a modern visitor sees, and that Troy stood almost on the water. That single finding makes the geography of the poem far more workable than it looks on the ground today, and it was produced not by classicists arguing about texts, but by geologists drilling cores in a floodplain. It is a useful reminder that this subject is not settled science handed down from on high. It is an argument, still running, between serious people looking at the same ground. And the essential question is, which of the 9, if any, is the Troy of the poem? The answer has moved over time as the evidence has improved, and the current consensus points to the 6th and 7th cities. Troy VI, a large, prosperous, powerfully fortified place that stood through much of the late Bronze Age, and Troy VIII, its immediate successor, which occupied the same walls in a visibly poorer and more crowded way, and which came to a violent end. One of those two, in the century or so around 1200 BC, is almost certainly the city that the Greek tradition remembered. The great irony is that this is precisely the layer that the man who found the site cared least about, because he was digging for something older and grander and drove his trench straight through it on the way down. Heinrich Schliemann is one of the most complicated figures in the history of archaeology, and it is worth being honest about him, because the legend he built around himself has been almost as durable as the one he was chasing. He was born poor in northern Germany in 1822, and he became, by ferocious effort and a real gift for languages and commerce, extremely rich. First in the indigo trade, then in the gold rush, then as a military contractor during the Crimean War, which is the kind of business that makes fortunes quickly and reputations slowly. By his 40s, he had money enough to stop, and he stopped, and turned to the obsession he had carried since childhood. The belief that Homer was describing real places, and that anyone who read the poem carefully enough could find them. He told the story, later, of his father showing him a picture of burning Troy when he was 7, and of his own childish declaration that one day he would dig it up. Scholars have found reason to doubt nearly every autobiographical detail Schliemann ever published, including that one. He was a man who improved his own story as he went, which is an uncomfortable trait in someone whose factual claims about the ancient world we are obliged to weigh. But he did the thing. Guided in no small part by an Englishman named Frank Calvert, who owned part of the Hisarlik mound, and who had already concluded on good evidence that it was the site and lacked only the money to prove it, Schliemann began digging in 1870. He dug the way a man digs who is certain of what lies beneath and impatient to reach it. With hundreds of workmen and a great trench cut straight down through the middle of the mound, removing in a season what modern excavators would spend decades recording. He found walls and burnt layers, and he announced the discovery of Troy to the world with a flair for publicity that no academic of the period could match. And in 1873, near the bottom of his trench, he found the gold. Thousands of pieces, diadems and earrings and vessels and beads, and named it Priam's treasure, and had his young Greek wife photographed wearing the jewelry of, as he believed, Helen herself. It was not Priam's. The layer it came from, Troy II, dates to around 1,000 years before the late Bronze Age. The treasure belonged to a city that had already been ancient ruins when the events of the poem were supposed to happen. and the trench that reached it had cut brutally through everything above, including the very levels that later work would identify as the likeliest Troy of the tradition. Schliemann also smuggled the treasure out of Ottoman territory, which soured relations and ended in a settlement, and the collection would go on to have an extraordinary afterlife of its own. Displayed in Berlin, vanishing at the end of the Second World War, and reappearing decades later in Moscow, where much of it remains, still disputed. The story of that disappearance is worth telling, because it is the strangest chapter in the object's long life. The treasure had been in Berlin for decades, and as the Second World War closed in on the city, it was packed into crates and moved to a flak tower near the zoo for protection. In May 1945, the director of the museum handed the crates over to the advancing Soviet forces. Then they vanished. For nearly 50 years, the gold of Troy was simply gone, presumed destroyed in the fighting or lost in the chaos, and scholars wrote about it as a casualty of the war. It was not until 1993, with the Soviet Union dissolved, that Russia acknowledged what had happened. The treasure had been flown to Moscow as war booty and had been sitting in the vaults of the Pushkin Museum the entire time. It went back on display in 1996 to considerable international friction and remains there. 3 countries now have a claim of some kind. Turkey argues that the objects were taken illegally out of Ottoman territory in the first place and belong where they were found. Germany argues that it acquired them lawfully thereafter and that they were removed from Berlin as spoils of war. Russia argues that they are legitimate compensation for the cultural destruction inflicted on the Soviet Union by Germany and has passed legislation to that effect. All 3 positions have real force, and the dispute has no obvious resolution, which means that the treasure Schliemann dug out of a hillside in 1873 is likely to stay exactly where it is. So the gold that a German businessman dug out of an Ottoman hillside and smuggled to Athens, that was named for a king who did not own it, and photographed on the neck of a young woman who was not Helen, spent half a century hidden in a Moscow basement, and is now claimed by 3 countries at once. Few objects have ever had a more complicated afterlife, and it began with a man in a hurry, digging too fast, in the wrong layer. The fair verdict is a double one, and both halves are true. Schliemann's methods destroyed evidence that can never be recovered, and his claims require constant checking against what he actually found rather than what he said he found. And he was right about the fundamental thing, when the entire learned world was wrong. There was a city on that hill. He proved it by putting a spade into the ground, and everything we now know about the real Troy, including all the ways in which he was mistaken, descends from that. So what did the later, more careful digging actually find? What kind of place was Troy in the age when the war is supposed to have happened? The picture that has emerged, especially over the last few decades, is of a city considerably more impressive than the modest citadel that earlier generations of scholars imagined. The fortifications of Troy VI are genuinely formidable. Great walls of finely cut limestone blocks, built with a distinctive inward slope so that the face of the wall leans back as it rises, standing several meters high even now in the surviving stretches, and originally topped with a mud brick superstructure that would have raised them higher still. There were towers and carefully designed gates, and the whole circuit was laid out with an obvious understanding of how such a place would be attacked. Inside stood large houses on terraces rising toward the summit, where a palace almost certainly stood before later builders leveled the top of the mound away. That leveling is one of the site's real tragedies. When the Greeks and Romans of the classical period built their own town of Ilion on the mound, they wanted a flat platform for a temple of Athena, and they took the top of the hill off to get one, carting away, along with a great deal of earth, whatever had stood at the very summit of the Bronze Age citadel. If there was a palace, if there was an archive of clay tablets like the ones that survived at Hattusa and Pylos, if there was anything with writing on it that might have told us the city's own name for itself and the name of its last king, it went into the fill of a Hellenistic terrace 2,500 years ago. The single most likely place to find Troy's own voice was destroyed by people who came there because they loved the poem. And beyond the citadel, this is the finding that changed the picture most, lies a lower town. Magnetic survey and excavation have traced a substantial settled area spreading out to the south of the fortress, with its own defensive ditch cut into the bedrock, an area many times larger than the citadel itself. That transforms the arithmetic. A citadel alone might hold a few hundred people, a chief and his retainers, which is hardly a city worth a 10-year war. A citadel plus a walled lower town of that extent suggests a population that could plausibly have run to several thousand, perhaps considerably more. A genuine regional centre, one of the more significant places on that coast, and a prize worth taking. The material found there tells a consistent story of wealth and connection. Imported pottery, evidence of trade with the Mycenaean Greek world and with the Anatolian interior, spindle halls in enormous quantities suggesting textile production on a serious scale, and a detail Homer would have enjoyed. Abundant horse bones in a poem that never tires of calling the Trojans breakers and tamers of horses. Whatever else it was, Troy was a place where people were rich enough to buy foreign goods, organized enough to raise monumental walls, and important enough that a great empire in the interior kept it in its diplomatic correspondence. Which brings us to the letters. Troy itself left no writing. Not a tablet, not an inscription, nothing that speaks in its own voice, which is why the city is silent about its own end. But the empire that dominated Anatolia in those centuries was one of the great record-keeping states of the ancient world, and its archives survived, baked hard in the fire that destroyed its capital. The Hittites wrote everything down: treaties, letters, complaints, ritual instructions, the correspondence of kings. And in those tablets, recovered from the ruins of Hattusa in the Anatolian highlands, there appears a small kingdom on the western coast called Wilusa. The name matters. The poem calls the city by two names: Troy and Ilios, which in its older form was something closer to Wilios. Wilusa and Wilios are, to the eye of a linguist, the same word in two languages. That is not a resemblance of the kind one shrugs off. It is a solid philological correspondence, and it places a kingdom with Troy's name in Troy's region in exactly Troy's period, in contemporary documents written by people who had no interest whatever in Greek poetry. What the tablets say about Wilusa is prosaic and therefore valuable. It was a vassal kingdom on the Hittite periphery, in the loose confederation of western Anatolian states, and it was troublesome in the ordinary way that peripheries are troublesome. Sometimes loyal, sometimes not, occasionally the object of rebellion or of interference from outside. There survives an actual treaty, drawn up between a Hittite great king and the ruler of Wilusa, and the name of that ruler is Alexandru. Paris, in the poem, has a second name, used constantly, Alexandros. Alexandru and Alexandros are, again, the same name. A king of Wilusa in the 13th century BC bore the name that Greek tradition gives to the Trojan prince who started the war. It is very important to be careful here, and this is exactly the point where popular accounts stop being careful. This does not mean the treaty was signed by the Paris of the poem, or that Paris existed. Names recur, dynasties reuse them. The name was current in Western Anatolia and may have been borne by many men. What it does establish is something quieter and, in its way, more impressive. That the Greek tradition, 400 years and a dark age after the Bronze Age ended, preserved a genuine Western Anatolian royal name and attached it to a genuine Western Anatolian city. Somebody remembered. Not accurately, not in detail, but the memory had real material in it. There is more in the archives, and it thickens the picture. Letters mention conflict over Wilusa. One remarkable document, a letter from a Hittite king to the ruler of a power called Ahiawa, refers in passing to a past disagreement between them over Wilusa and says that they are now at peace about it. Another describes a local warlord raiding the coast and causing trouble for the empire, backed at times by Ahiawan interests. This is not a war of 1,000 ships. It is friction, competition, proxy meddling, the ordinary politics of a frontier where two spheres of influence touched. One document in particular has been argued over for decades, and it gives the flavor of the whole business better than any summary. It is a long letter from a Hittite great king to the king of Ahiawa, conventionally called the Tawagalawa letter after a man named in it, and it is essentially a diplomatic complaint. The Hittite king is exasperated about a troublemaker named Piamaradu, a renegade warlord operating in western Anatolia, raiding, stirring up trouble among the vassal states, taking people away, and then slipping out of reach to territory the Ahiawans controlled, where the Hittites could not follow. The letter is a request that this man be handed over or at least restrained, and it is written in a tone of aggrieved patience that anyone who has ever dealt with an uncooperative neighbor will recognize instantly. And in the middle of it, almost in passing, comes the line that has launched 1,000 articles, a reference to a matter concerning Wilusa, over which the two of them had once been at odds, and about which the Hittite king says, "They have now come to an understanding." That is all it says. It does not describe a war. It mentions a past quarrel between the Hittite Empire and a Greek-speaking sea power over the city of Troy, and says the matter has been settled. It is the closest thing to contemporary documentary evidence for a Greek conflict over Troy that exists anywhere in the world, and it is a single clause in a letter about somebody else. There is a second document worth mentioning, usually called the Manapa-Hunter letter, in which a local Western Anatolian ruler writes to the Hittite king with an awkward report. The troublesome Piamaradu has attacked the land of Wilusa, and the writer has been unable to do anything about it, having been ill. So we have, in contemporary correspondence, an actual recorded attack on Troy in the 13th century BC. Not by a Greek coalition under a paramount king, but by a freelancing warlord with, at various times, Ahiawan backing. If you were looking for the kind of real event that could seed a tradition, that is very much the shape of it. A raid on Wilusa, mounted by a man operating on the fringes of Greek influence, at a moment when the empire that was supposed to protect the city could not reach it. No poet would sing about Piamaradu, but 500 years of singers, working over the memory of raids like his, could produce Agamemnon. But it is friction over Troy, between the Anatolian power and a sea power to the west in the right centuries. And that raises the question of who exactly Ahiawa was. For a long time, the identity of Ahiawa was one of the great arguments in Bronze Age scholarship, and while it is not fully settled, the balance of opinion has moved a long way. The Hittite tablets describe Ahiawa as a foreign power, based overseas, with interests along the Anatolian coast, and a king whom the Hittite great king at one point addresses as an equal. A great king, the highest diplomatic register, a courtesy extended to only a handful of rulers in the world. Its people appear in Anatolia, sometimes trading, sometimes backing local troublemakers, sometimes fighting. And the name itself maps, by the ordinary rules of sound change, onto the Greek word Achaioi, the Achaeans, which is precisely what Homer calls the Greeks. If that identification holds, and most scholars now think it does in some form, then the Hittite archives contain the only contemporary external record we have of the Mycenaean Greeks, and they describe them exactly as the archaeology and the poem both suggest they were. A maritime power on the western horizon, wealthy, well-armed, sometimes a trading partner, sometimes a nuisance, occasionally raiding, and interested in the Anatolian coast. What the tablets do not describe is a unified Greek nation. Ahiawa's king is one king. The Greek world of that age was a scatter of rival palace kingdoms, and any joint expedition would have been a coalition of the kind that forms for a season and dissolves afterward, which, if you think about it, is precisely how the poem describes Agamemnon's command, a paramount king who must constantly negotiate with proud subordinates who might at any moment take their ships and go home. Achilles nearly does exactly that. So here is what the letters give us, stated as carefully as it can be stated. In the 13th century BC, there was a city called Wilusa on the northwest Anatolian coast. It had kings, one of whom was called Alexandru. It was a vassal of the Hittite Empire and a recurring point of contention. A Greek-speaking sea power to the west had interests there and was at some point in conflict with the Hittites over it. And all of this is preserved not in poetry, but in the diplomatic correspondence of a literate empire that could not have cared less about Homer. What the letters do not give us is a war of the poem's kind. No 10-year siege, no coalition of 1,000 ships, no sack. If a Greek expedition had destroyed a Hittite vassal capital in a great campaign, one might reasonably expect the Hittite archives to say so, and they do not, though it must be said that the archives are damaged, incomplete, and thin for the final decades before the empire itself collapsed, which is exactly the window in question. The absence is suggestive, but not decisive. It is another honest hole. Before we look at how the city died, it is worth understanding why anyone would have wanted it. Because the poem's answer, a stolen queen, is the least convincing part of the whole tradition, and the real answer is standing right there in the landscape. Look at the map. The Aegean Sea narrows at its northeastern corner into a long, thin channel, the Dardanelles, which runs for some 60 kilometers before opening into the small Sea of Marmara, which in turn narrows again at the Bosphorus before opening into the Black Sea. That chain of straits is the only water route between the Mediterranean world and the entire Black Sea basin, with its grain, its metals, its timber, its horses, and its access to the rivers of the steppe. Everything that moved between those two worlds by water moved through that channel, and Troy sits at its mouth. Now add the two things that turn a good position into a great one. First, the current. Water flows steadily out of the Black Sea and down through the straits toward the Aegean, so a ship going north is fighting the flow the entire way. Second, the wind. For much of the sailing season, the prevailing winds in that channel blow from the north, straight down it, meaning a ship trying to go north is fighting the wind as well as the current. For a Bronze Age vessel, with a square sail and a bank of oars, that combination is not a nuisance, it is frequently a stop. Ships bound for the Black Sea simply had to wait, sometimes for days, sometimes far longer, until conditions allowed the passage. And where do they wait? In the sheltered bay below Troy, on the beach at the mouth of the strait, in the plain where crews could camp and get water and buy food and repair gear. A city standing precisely there, with walls and a market and a harbour, does not need to conquer anybody to become wealthy. It simply has to exist at the place where everyone is forced to stop and to charge for the services rendered. Anchorage, provisions, storage, protection, and very likely a share of the cargo for the privilege of passing. This is the ancient equivalent of owning the only bridge on the only road. And this is not a modern theory imposed on the evidence. The ancients knew it perfectly well. Herodotus describes Xerxes bridging the Hellespont with ships because armies as well as cargoes had to cross there. Later Greek writers discuss the difficulty of the passage. The Athenians of the classical age fought wars to keep that route open, because the grain that fed their city came down it from the Black Sea, and any power that closed the straits could starve them. A strategic fact that would still be shaping wars in the 20th century when a British and Anzac army landed on the Gallipoli Peninsula in sight of the plain of Troy in an attempt to force the same channel, and failed, and left the same coastline covered in graves. The geography does not change. 3,000 years after the Bronze Age city burned, men were still dying over which fleet could get up that strait. It explains the walls, it explains the imported goods, it explains the textile industry, and it explains, far better than any love story, why a coalition of raiders from across the water might have thought a season's campaign against that particular headland was worth the trouble. It helps to see Troy not as an isolated fortress on a lonely coast, but as one node in the most connected world the Earth had yet produced. Because that is what the Late Bronze Age was, and it is what makes both the city's wealth and its destruction intelligible. For roughly 4 centuries, the Eastern Mediterranean functioned as a single system. Egypt, the Hittites, Babylon, Assyria, the Kingdom of Mitanni, the Mycenaean Greeks, the merchant cities of the Levantine coast, Cyprus with its copper, all of them bound together by trade routes and diplomatic marriages and a shared elite culture of gift exchange. Kings called each other brother in their letters and quarreled like brothers over the quality of the gold one had sent the other. And beneath the diplomacy ran the material reality. Bronze, the metal that named the age, required copper and tin, and the tin came from very far away indeed, so that arming a single soldier depended on a supply chain running across thousands of kilometers and through the territory of people you might well be at war with. Interdependence was not an ideal in that world. It was a structural fact. And it made everyone rich, and it made everyone fragile. Nothing illustrates that better than a single shipwreck. In the 1980s, a sponge diver off the southern Turkish coast reported seeing what he described as metal biscuits, with ears lying on the seabed, and what archaeologists recovered from that site over more than a decade of underwater excavation turned out to be a merchant vessel that had gone down around 1300 BC with its cargo intact. The manifest is astonishing. 10 tons of copper in ox-hide-shaped ingots, roughly a ton of tin. Very nearly the exact ratio required to make bronze. Along with glass ingots, ebony, ivory, ostrich eggshells, resin, olives, weapons, tools, jewelry, and finished objects originating in Egypt, Canaan, Cyprus, Mycenaean Greece, Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and further afield still. One ship, one voyage, and the products of half the known world in its hold. That is the world Troy sat in, and it is the world that came apart within a century of that ship going down. Into that system Troy fitted precisely. It sat at the junction of two great circuits, the Aegean and Mediterranean world to the south and west, the Black Sea and its hinterlands to the north and east, and it took its living from the traffic between them. Its material culture shows exactly that hybrid position. Pottery and goods from the Mycenaean Greek world, alongside forms and practices that belong firmly to Anatolia and to the Hittite sphere. The pottery tells the story in miniature. A great deal of what was used in Troy in that period is locally made grey ware in shapes with clear Anatolian ancestry, the ordinary dishes of a Western Anatolian town. Alongside it, in quantity, comes Mycenaean pottery, fine painted stirrup jars and cups from the Greek world, some imported and some, tellingly, imitated locally by Trojan potters copying the foreign style. That is the archaeological signature of a place inside a trade network and impressed by its neighbours' goods. The same pattern you would find in any port city in any century, where the local ware sits on the shelf next to the fashionable import and the local workshop starts making knockoffs. Trojans drank from Mycenaean-style cups. Whatever happened later, for generations before it, Greek things were desirable in Troy. It was, culturally, a border city, facing both ways, which is often the most profitable and the most dangerous thing a city can be. And it is worth noticing what that means for the story. The poem presents the war as a clash between two peoples, Greeks and Trojans, foreign to one another and speaking, one assumes, different tongues. And yet Homer never makes anything of a language barrier, and his Trojans worship the same gods, observe the same customs of hospitality and burial, and behave in every respect like the Greeks who are killing them. Scholars have long noted this as an artistic choice, and so it may be. But it also happens to be plausible. In a connected age, the elites of a trading city at the edge of the Greek world would have known Greeks, dealt with Greeks, possibly married Greeks, and shared a great deal of the same aristocratic culture with them. The war in the poem is not a collision of alien civilizations. It is a quarrel inside one world, among people who understood each other perfectly. That is a far more disturbing kind of war, and the poem knows it. We have climbed the hill now, and read the letters, and seen why the city stood where it stood. Before we look at how it died, the story pauses again and rests here, on the shore below the citadel, at the end of a day in the age when Troy was still standing and still rich. The sun is going down over the Aegean, out past the mouth of the strait, and the whole channel has turned to hammered gold. The current runs steadily as it always does, drawing its long silver lines down the middle of the water, and the far shore has gone blue and soft with distance. Below the citadel, in the sheltered bay, ships are drawn up on the beach for the night. A dozen of them, maybe more, waiting as ships always wait here for the wind to turn. Their crews have made camp along the strand, and the small fires are being lit, and the smoke goes up straight in the evening calm and then bends away south with the last of the breeze. Up on the ridge, the city is catching the last of the light. The great sloping walls glow warm, almost amber, where the sun touches them, and darken to grey where they do not, and above them the roofs of the houses rise in terraces toward the summit. Someone is driving animals in through the gate for the night. The sound of them carries a long way in the still air, the bells and the calls and the complaint of the herd. Along the walls, the sentries are beginning their evening round. Down in the lower town, the day's business is folding up. The looms quiet, the workshops banked, the market cleared, the last carts coming in from the fields where the two rivers meet. And out on the plain, the wind that has kept 100 ships waiting drops away toward evening, as it usually does, and everything goes very quiet. The reeds stop moving. The water in the channel loses its chop and lies flat and burnished from shore to shore. The gulls come in off the sea and settle. Horses graze in the dusk on the flats below the city, and their shapes go dim and then vanish into the dark ground while the sky above is still gold. It is one of the most ordinary and most beautiful hours in the world, the hour when the work is done and the light is going. And it happened here, on this coast, at the mouth of this strait, every evening for 1,000 years. On the beach, a crew from somewhere far south, Cyprus perhaps, or the Levantine coast, is eating around its fire, and the language they are speaking is not the language of the city on the hill, and nobody minds. They have been here 4 days waiting for the wind, and they may be here 4 more. One of them is mending a sail by the light of the fire, working slowly, in no particular hurry, because there is nowhere to hurry to until the weather changes. Another has gone up to the town during the day and come back with bread and oil and a bronze fitting he needed, and has told the others what he heard up there, which was mostly gossip. This is what a trading city on a strait actually consists of, most of the time. Not war and not heroes, but tired crews waiting out the weather, buying provisions, and sleeping on a beach under a wall that somebody else built. Rest here a while in that evening, before we go on to the ash. Up on the wall, a sentry has stopped walking and is leaning on the parapet looking west, the way people do at that hour, not thinking about anything in particular, watching the colour go out of the sky over the sea. He has done this every evening of his adult life. Behind him, the town noise is dropping away, voice by voice, as the doors close and the lamps go on inside. In the harbour, the water has gone completely still and holds the last of the light like a sheet of beaten copper, and one small boat is coming in very slowly, oars dipping and lifting, leaving a long, widening V on the flat surface that will still be spreading when the sun is gone. The city on the ridge does not know what is coming. Nobody ever does. The traders on the beach are only waiting for the wind. The fires are small and warm along the strand, and the great walls hold the last of the light, and out on the darkening water the current keeps running down toward the sea, patient and indifferent, exactly as it is running tonight. Now to the evidence for the war itself, which is where the argument has always been fiercest, and where it is most important to look at what the ground actually contains rather than what one hopes it contains. The first thing to understand is that Troy was destroyed many times. Over 3,000 years of occupation, the city was ruined and rebuilt again and again by fire, by collapse, and, this coast being what it is, by earthquake. The site sits in an active seismic region, and at least one of the great destructions in the sequence bears the unmistakable signature of a quake. Walls displaced along their lines rather than smashed, buildings collapsed inward, no sign of fighting. That destruction ended Troy VI, the grand prosperous city with the finest walls, sometime around 1300 BC. For a while, scholars who wanted the poem to be history hoped that this was the Homeric fall and were disappointed because an earthquake is a poor substitute for Achilles. What came next is far more interesting. The survivors did not abandon the site. They rebuilt inside the same great walls, which had largely survived, and the city they made. Troy Viathia looks different in a way that archaeologists can read like handwriting. The spacious houses of the earlier phase were subdivided. New, smaller dwellings were crammed against the inside of the fortification wall, and in floor after floor, sunk into the ground, excavators found large storage jars. Pithoi, buried up to their necks, in numbers and in a distribution that suggests a population storing food inside the walls on a scale that ordinary domestic life does not require. That is the archaeology of a city under threat. It is also, it should be said, an interpretation, and there is a respectable alternative. Subdivided houses and buried storage jars can indicate a siege mentality. They can equally indicate a poorer, more crowded, more agriculturally self-reliant town in a period when the wider trade economy was contracting, which, in the decades around 1200 BC, it demonstrably was everywhere in the region. A city that had lived off maritime commerce and suddenly found the shipping drying up would look very much like this. More people packed inside, more food stored at home, less wealth, hasty and cheap construction. On that reading, Troy Viathia is not a fortress waiting for an army, but a town in an economic depression, and the fire that ended it needs no Greeks at all. Both readings are on the table, and the ground does not obviously choose between them. More people packed into the defended area than it was designed to hold. Provisions laid in against a time when going out to the fields might not be possible. It is what a place looks like when the countryside is no longer safe and everyone has come inside the walls to wait. There is a particular kind of evidence that makes this vivid. In one of the houses of that phase, excavators found a jar sunk into the floor that still had grain in it. carbonized, preserved by the fire that destroyed the building. Somebody filled that jar and covered it and never came back for it. Whatever happened to the city happened before they emptied it. It does not tell you who they were afraid of, or for how long, or whether the danger ever came. But it tells you they were afraid. And then Troy Vitia burned. The destruction level is clear in the ground, a layer of ash and burnt debris, collapsed walls, buildings destroyed by fire across the site. The date, on the best current evidence, falls somewhere around 1180 BC, give or take a few decades, which places it squarely in the window that Greek tradition, working backwards through generations of kings, assigned to the fall of Troy. A crowded, fortified, provisioned city at the right place, burned at the right time. That is the core of the case, and it is a genuinely striking coincidence of place and date. How confident can we be about that date? More confident than about most things in this story, and less than one would like. The dating rests chiefly on pottery, on the styles of imported Mycenaean ware found in the relevant layers, which can be placed within the established sequence of Aegean ceramic phases, which in turn is tied, through cross-links with Egypt, to a historical chronology that is reasonably firm. Radiocarbon has been applied where suitable material exists and broadly supports the ceramic dating. What that gives is a destruction somewhere in the decades around 1180 BC, with an uncertainty of perhaps half a century in either direction. The Greek tradition itself, working backward through generations of kings, produced various dates for the fall of Troy, the most famous being the calculation of the scholar Eratosthenes in the 3rd century BC, who put it at 1184 BC. That a Hellenistic librarian counting backwards through legendary genealogies landed within a few decades of the destruction layer that modern archaeology identifies is either a striking vindication of the tradition's memory or a coincidence, and scholars have argued both. Fire alone proves nothing. Cities burn by accident, and a town of tightly packed mud brick houses with hearths in them will burn spectacularly without any help from an enemy. So the question becomes whether the burnt layer contains the signature of violence. And here the evidence is real but thinner than the popular accounts suggest, which is exactly why the argument continues. There are weapons in and around the destruction level. Bronze arrowheads have been found in the layer, some of a type associated with the Aegean world rather than Anatolia, and sling stones have been recovered in quantities and in places that suggest they were gathered as ammunition and used. Spearheads and a scattering of other military hardware turn up. None of this is overwhelming. A city's ordinary life includes weapons, and objects move between layers on a site that has been dug into for millennia. But arrowheads lying in a burnt street are more suggestive than arrowheads in a storeroom. More telling and grimmer are the human remains. Bodies were found in the destruction context in circumstances that do not look like normal burial. Remains in the streets and in the ruins rather than in the cemetery, in at least some cases apparently left where they fell. A community that buries its dead with care and then suddenly does not is a community that has lost control of its own ground. That is consistent with a sack. It is also consistent with an epidemic, or with a disaster severe enough that the survivors fled rather than stayed to bury anyone. And it is worth being explicit about how thin the sample is, because popular accounts routinely imply a battlefield full of bodies, and that is not what was found. The human remains associated with the destruction are a handful. A partial skeleton in a doorway, bones in the fill, a jaw here and a skull there. From a city of several thousand people that supposedly fell to a storming army, that is almost nothing. There are 3 ways to read it. Perhaps the sack was less total than the poem says, and most people survived and left. Perhaps the dead were collected and burned or buried elsewhere by whoever occupied the ruin afterwards, since the site was reoccupied fairly quickly. Or perhaps the excavated fraction of the city is simply too small to be representative. And it is worth remembering that even after a century and a half, only a portion of the mound and a small percentage of the lower town have been dug at all. Most of Troy is still in the ground. The next generation's excavators will know things we do not, and the tools keep improving in ways that would have been unimaginable even a generation ago. ground-penetrating radar and magnetometry can now map buried structures without a spade touching them. Isotope analysis of teeth can tell where an individual grew up, which means that in principle the bones from a destruction layer could reveal whether the dead were locals or came from across the sea. Ancient DNA can establish relationships and origins. Residue analysis can identify what was in a storage jar 3,000 years after it was emptied. None of these existed when the great arguments about Troy were framed, and all of them are now being applied to Bronze Age sites across the region. It is entirely possible that the decisive evidence about what happened on that hill is still sitting in the ground, waiting for a technique that has not been invented yet. And there are the hasty repairs. Patches to the fortification, blocked gateways, defensive adjustments made quickly and roughly in a way that contrasts with the beautiful masonry of the earlier phase. Somebody was preparing for something without much time and without much skill available. Put it together, and the honest summary runs like this. Troy Vitia was a crowded city that was storing food inside its walls, that made rough emergency repairs to its defenses, that contains weapons in its destruction level, that has dead lying where they should not be, and that burned around 1180 BC. That is a consistent picture of a fortified town that came under attack and fell. It is not proof. No single element is decisive, and every element has an alternative explanation. But the elements point the same way, and in archaeology, a convergence of independent indications is often the strongest thing you get. What the ground absolutely does not contain is any indication of who did it, or why, or for how long they came. There is no Greek name in the ash. There is nothing that says 10 years. The archaeology is entirely compatible with the poem, and entirely compatible with a dozen other stories. So suppose there was a war, not the poem's war, the real one, whatever it was. What would it actually have looked like? Start by discarding the numbers. 1,000 ships and 100,000 men is epic arithmetic, the kind of figure that grows in the telling. The Mycenaean palace kingdoms were small, their populations modest, their armies numbering in the hundreds or the low thousands. A large Greek expedition of that era might have been a few dozen ships and perhaps a couple of thousand men, which was an enormous undertaking for such societies and would have strained them badly. Discard the 10 years, too, at least as a continuous siege. Bronze Age armies could not sustain a decade-long investment of a walled city on a foreign coast. There was no logistics system on Earth capable of feeding an army in the field for 10 years, which is precisely why the tradition itself has the Greeks constantly raiding elsewhere for supplies. What is plausible is something the poem actually preserves in its background if you read it carefully: seasonal campaigning. A fleet crosses in the sailing season, raids the coast, takes what it can, and goes home before the winter. Perhaps it comes back the next year. Perhaps the trouble persists in that region for years, a chronic frontier war of raid and counter-raid, and the tradition later compresses a generation of intermittent conflict into a single continuous decade, which is exactly the sort of thing oral tradition does. And the cause was almost certainly not a woman. It was, if the historians of the last century have taught us anything, the ordinary business of the Bronze Age: plunder, control of a trade bottleneck, dynastic quarrels, opportunism at the expense of a weakening neighbor. Troy was rich, Troy was at a choke point, and Troy sat on the far edge of an empire that was, in those decades, increasingly unable to protect its periphery. A coalition of Greek raiders taking advantage of that is not merely plausible, it is roughly what the Hittite letters describe happening in the region already, on a smaller scale, more than once. There is one further possibility that deserves its due, because serious people have argued it. The destruction of Troy Vitia may have had nothing to do with Greeks at all. Around 1200 BC, the entire eastern Mediterranean began to come apart. And that is a story this channel has told in full elsewhere, but its outline matters here. Within a couple of generations, the Hittite Empire collapsed and its capital was burned. The Mycenaean palaces of Greece were destroyed one after another, cities across the Levant were sacked, trade routes failed, and the whole interconnected world of the late Bronze Age fell into ruin. Troy burned in exactly that window. It may have burned for the same reasons everything else did, whatever those reasons were. Invasion, drought, famine, internal revolt, systems, failure, or all of them together. In that reading, The Trojan War is not a cause of anything. It is one small local episode inside a general catastrophe, remembered because a poetic tradition happened to fasten onto it and forget everything else. And it is worth pausing on the scale of what was happening around Troy in those decades, because it puts the whole question in a different light. Within the span of roughly one lifetime, somewhere between about 1200 and 1150 BC, nearly every major power in the eastern Mediterranean either collapsed outright or was crippled. The Hittite Empire, which had ruled Anatolia for 4 centuries and treated with Egypt as an equal, ceased to exist. Its capital was burned and abandoned and was not reoccupied. The Mycenaean palaces of mainland Greece were destroyed one after another, and Greece entered the long, illiterate darkness we have already described. The great trading cities of the Levantine coast were sacked, one of them leaving behind a final, desperate letter, baked hard in the fire that destroyed the city, describing enemy ships already in sight. Egypt survived, barely, after pitched battles against a coalition of sea-borne invaders whom its inscriptions call the Sea Peoples, and never recovered its former reach. Trade routes failed, cities shrank or vanished. The whole interconnected system that had made the Bronze Age possible came apart inside 2 generations, and the causes are still argued over. Drought, famine, earthquake swarms, migration, plague, invasion, internal revolt, or the explanation most scholars now favor. All of them at once, striking a system too tightly coupled to absorb any of them. Troy burned in the middle of that, which means the honest historian has to hold 2 possibilities side by side and cannot choose between them on present evidence. Either a Greek coalition sacked the city in one of the last great raids before the raiders' own world fell apart, or Troy went down for the same unknown reasons that took down everything else that decade, and the Greek tradition, casting about for a story to explain the ruin on that famous headland, supplied one. Both are entirely consistent with what is in the ground. Here is the part of the Troy problem that is, to my mind, more astonishing than the war itself: the transmission. Because whatever happened on that coast happened around 1200 BC, and the poem that describes it was written down around 700 BC, and in between lies a gap of roughly 500 years during which Greece could not write at all. The collapse took the Mycenaean world down completely. The palaces burned, the kingdoms dissolved, the population fell, the trade routes closed, and Linear B, the script the palace scribes had used for their inventories, simply stopped. It was a bureaucrat's tool, tied to the palace economy, and when the palaces died, it died with them, so thoroughly that when Greeks began writing again centuries later, they did not adapt the old script. They borrowed a completely new alphabet from the Phoenicians and started over. For something like 4 centuries, in the period we call the Greek Dark Age, no Greek wrote anything down. There are no documents, no chronicles, no king lists. Whatever crossed that gap crossed it in human memory alone. And something did cross it. This is where the study of oral poetry did its most beautiful work. In the early 20th century, a young American scholar named Milman Parry went to the mountains of Yugoslavia to listen to living oral poets, illiterate singers who performed enormously long heroic songs from memory, accompanied on a stringed instrument, in coffee houses and at gatherings. What he found there changed how we read Homer forever. These singers were not memorizing fixed texts word for word. They were composing in performance, using a vast inherited toolkit of formulas, set phrases that fit the rhythm exactly, ready-made lines and half-lines and whole typical scenes, which allowed them to build a poem in real time, differently every night, out of traditional material. And Homer's poems are full of exactly that machinery. The recurring epithets, the swift-footed Achilles and the wine-dark sea and the rosy-fingered dawn, the repeated arming scenes and feast scenes and similes. The Iliad is a written record of an oral art. The fieldwork itself is one of the great stories in the humanities. Parry and his assistant Albert Lord went out in the 1930s with recording equipment and sat in coffee houses in the Balkans listening to men perform and made recordings that fill shelves. They found singers who could perform for hours, night after night. They found one who, asked to repeat a song he had heard only once, produced a version several times longer than the original, and insisted it was word for word the same. Because in that tradition, the same song means the same story faithfully told, not the same words. They watched a young man learn the craft, first absorbing the stories by listening for years, then learning to handle the meter, then gradually acquiring the stock of formulas and typical scenes until he could compose fluently at speed. And they noticed that the singers themselves did not experience this as composition at all. They said they were simply telling what happened. Parry died young, in an accident, before he could finish the work. Lord carried it on for decades. But what they had established was decisive. A long narrative poem does not require writing. It requires a living tradition, a technical apparatus of formulas, and an audience. And given those, it can carry a story across centuries with the plot largely stable while the wording changes every night. Lord went further, in a book that became the foundation of the field, and argued that the singer does not experience himself as an author at all but as a transmitter. That the concept of a fixed original text, which is so natural to us, does not exist inside the tradition. Every performance is the poem. There is no correct version to deviate from, which raises a genuinely strange question about the Iliad. What exactly was written down around 700 BC? Not the poem, because there was no such thing. Only one performance, by one singer, on one occasion, fixed by the accident of somebody having an alphabet and the patience to use it. What we have is a snapshot of a living thing, taken at a moment, and everything that tradition had been and might have gone on becoming is gone. That is the machine that brought Troy through the dark. And it explains something that had puzzled readers for centuries. Why the poems are so repetitive. Every reader notices it. The same phrases returning, the same epithets attached to the same names whether or not they fit the moment. Dawn appearing with rosy fingers for the 100th time, Achilles called swift-footed even while sitting still. To a modern eye trained on written literature, this looks like poverty of invention. Once you understand oral composition, it looks like the opposite. It is the working machinery of a performer building verse at speed in front of an audience, reaching for the phrase that fills the line while his mind runs ahead to the next thing. The repetitions are not a flaw in the poem. They are the fingerprints of the technique that saved it. That discovery matters here for one reason above all. It tells us how a memory could survive 500 silent years. Not as a fixed account, but as a living tradition, sung and re-sung, with a real event somewhere at its core and centuries of elaboration accumulating around it. And oral traditions do preserve genuine information across long periods, sometimes with remarkable fidelity in specific details, while at the same time freely inventing, compressing, transposing, and dressing the past in the clothes of the present. Both things are true of the same tradition at the same time. That is the maddening, wonderful nature of the material we are working with. So the question, did the Trojan War happen, is slightly the wrong question, and the better one is, how much real Bronze Age information is embedded in this poem, and can we identify it? And to that question, remarkably, there are answers. The test is simple in principle. Find things in the poem that a poet of the 8th century BC could not possibly have known from his own world. Objects, practices, places that had vanished centuries before he was born and were only recovered by archaeologists in modern times. If such things are there, then genuine Bronze Age material really did survive inside the tradition. They are there. The most famous is a helmet. In one passage, Homer describes a curious piece of headgear, a leather cap covered with rows of boar's tusks, split and sewn on in alternating directions. Nothing remotely like it existed in the Greek world of the historical period. It sounds like invention, and for centuries readers assumed it was. Then excavators began pulling boar's tusk helmets, exactly as described, out of Mycenaean graves. A distinctive Bronze Age item that had gone out of use hundreds of years before Homer and was known to nobody in his day. The poet was describing a real object he had never seen, because the description had been carried down the tradition intact in a metrically convenient formula for half a millennium. There are others. Homer's heroes sometimes carry a body-length tower shield of a type used in the Mycenaean period and abandoned long before the Archaic Age. Certain phrases and place names in the poem preserve archaic linguistic forms and geographical realities that fit the Bronze Age rather than the 8th century. The great catalogue of ships, that long list of contingents and homelands, includes places that were significant in Mycenaean times and were insignificant ruins by Homer's day, which is a very strange thing to invent. Silver-studded swords, particular vessels, particular burial practices. Scattered through the poem are pieces of a vanished world. One of the most striking is a cup. Homer describes the old king Nestor drinking from a vessel so heavy that another man could barely lift it when full. A great gold cup with 4 handles and doves worked on them and 2 supports beneath. It reads like poetic exaggeration, an old man's ridiculous tankard. Then Schliemann, digging at Mycenae half a century after anyone had taken the description seriously, pulled a gold cup out of a shaft grave with handles surmounted by birds, and although it is not Nestor's cup and is not identical to the description, it demonstrated that vessels of that general type and workmanship really had existed in the Mycenaean world and nowhere in Homer's own. The poet was working from a genuine memory of Bronze Age metalwork. There is also the matter of the geography beyond Troy. The catalogue of ships lists dozens of Greek towns with their contributions to the fleet, and some of those places were unimportant or entirely deserted in Homer's day. Places no 8th century poet had any reason to include or even to know about, but which excavation has since shown were substantial Mycenaean centres. A poet inventing a list would name the places his audience knew. This list names the places that mattered 500 years earlier, which is a very difficult thing to explain except by transmission. The clearest single case is Pylos. Homer's catalogue gives it a large contingent and treats it as a major kingdom under Old King Nestor. In Homer's own day, it was nothing, an obscure corner of the southwestern Peloponnese of no particular importance. Then, in 1939, an American archaeologist began digging at a site there and found, in his first season, a Mycenaean palace with an archive of clay tablets in it, baked hard by the fire that destroyed the building. Pylos had been exactly what the catalogue said it was, 500 years before Homer, and had then ceased to matter so completely that only the poem remembered. And running underneath all of it is the language itself. Homeric Greek is not the Greek anyone ever spoke. It is an artificial poetic dialect, a mixture of forms from different regions and different periods, containing words so archaic that the Greeks of the classical age no longer understood them and had to gloss them. Buried in that mixture are grammatical forms that vanished from spoken Greek centuries before the poems were written down, preserved because they fit the meter and the formulas carried them along. The poem is a linguistic archaeological site in its own right, with older strata beneath the newer ones, exactly like the mound it describes. And just as revealing are the things the tradition got wrong, because they show the mechanism working. Homer's heroes have chariots, which is correct. Chariots were the elite weapon of the late Bronze Age, but they use them absurdly. They drive to the battlefield, get out, fight on foot, and have the driver wait nearby like a taxi. No Bronze Age army fought that way. Chariots were mobile platforms for archers, used in massed formations, and they were the decisive arm of the age. What has happened is obvious once you see it. The tradition faithfully preserved the fact of chariots without preserving the knowledge of how they worked, because by the time the singers were singing, nobody had used one in war for centuries. So the poets put them in, and had their heroes do the only thing the poets could picture. The chariot is a fossil that the tradition carried but could no longer read. That is what we are dealing with. A poem containing authentic Bronze Age hardware, authentic Bronze Age geography, and a Bronze Age memory of a real coastal city, all of it wrapped in the values, assumptions, and misunderstandings of the much later world that did the singing. The past is genuinely in there. It is simply not in there whole. One question deserves its own hearing, because it is the first thing anybody asks, and because the attempts to answer it are more interesting than the question deserves. Was there a horse? Taken literally, almost certainly not. A hollow wooden statue large enough to hold armed men, built on a beach in view of a hostile city, left as a gift, and dragged inside by a garrisoned town in the middle of a war, is a story that works beautifully in performance and collapses under the mildest inspection. No commander in history has fallen for it. It belongs to the family of trickster tales that every culture tells, and its function in the tradition is obvious. The walls of Troy could not be taken by force, so the poets needed a way in, and cunning is the only key that fits a lock that strong. The horse exists because the walls were unbreakable, and the walls were unbreakable because the archaeology says they really were formidable. But the fact that it did not happen literally does not mean it came from nowhere, and several suggestions are worth weighing. The most popular is that the horse is a memory of a siege engine. Assyrian reliefs from a few centuries later show wheeled battering rams with protective housings. Wooden structures on wheels moved up against a wall, sheltering men inside them. To a poetic tradition that had lost all technical memory of how such things worked, a wooden object on wheels, full of soldiers, that got through the wall, could plausibly become a wooden horse full of soldiers that got through the gate. The difficulty is that there is no good evidence for such engines in the Aegean world of the 13th century BC. It is a tidy explanation for the wrong period. A second suggestion takes the horse as a ship. Ships in Greek poetry are routinely called horses of the sea. A vessel is a thing of curved timber that carries men, and one tradition of the story has the Greeks pretending to sail away and returning by night. A misunderstood metaphor. The men who came in the wooden horse, meaning the men who came in the ship, is the kind of thing that happens constantly in oral transmission. A third takes it as an earthquake. The god of the sea in Greek religion is also the god of earthquakes, and his sacred animal is the horse. He is called, in the poems, the Earth Shaker. Troy is in a seismic zone, and at least one of its cities was demonstrably destroyed by a quake, walls displaced along their lines. A tradition that a city's defenses were breached by the horse god, retold for centuries by people who no longer knew what that meant, could become a wooden horse that breached the walls. Of the three explanations, this is the most elegant, and it has the merit of matching something the ground actually shows. And a fourth possibility deserves stating plainly, that it is simply a good story, invented by a singer one night because the audience needed the city to fall, and cleverness is more satisfying than attrition. Not every element of a tradition is a garbled fact. Some of it is art. We cannot decide between these, and it is worth being comfortable with that. What can be said is that the horse, whatever its origin, has outlived every explanation offered for it, and has become the permanent symbol of a particular kind of catastrophe, the one you carry through your own gate, cheering, because it looks like a prize. So the night comes to the question it has been circling since the first sentence, and it deserves a straight answer rather than a dramatic one. Did the Trojan War happen? Take the claims one at a time, as a careful person would, and see how far each one can be pushed. Was there a city? Yes, this is no longer arguable. There was a substantial fortified settlement at Hisarlik throughout the late Bronze Age, with monumental walls, a lower town, wealth, trade connections in both directions, and a strategic position of real importance. It was called, in the diplomatic language of the age, Wailusa, which is the same word as the poem's Ilios. The city in the story is a real city, and it is where the story said it was. Was it destroyed? Yes, repeatedly, and specifically around 1180 BC, in the phase we call Troy Via, by fire. After a period in which its people had crowded inside the walls, buried storage jars in their floors, and made rough emergency repairs to the fortifications. The destruction level contains weapons, including arrowheads, and human remains in circumstances suggesting a breakdown of normal burial. Something violent happened there at roughly the traditional date. Was it destroyed by Greeks? Unproven, and probably unprovable. It is consistent with the evidence. It is also consistent with a local Anatolian conflict, with an episode in the general collapse that was consuming the whole region in exactly those decades, or with a combination. The arrowhead types are suggestive of the Aegean. They are not a signature. No text from any archive says the Achaeans burned Wailusa. Was there a coalition expedition under a paramount king, lasting 10 years, over a stolen queen? Almost certainly not in anything like that form. The scale is epic exaggeration. The duration is compression of a longer or more intermittent conflict, and the cause is a story-shaped explanation grafted onto what was, in all probability, an economic and strategic quarrel over the richest choke point in the eastern Mediterranean. Did Achilles exist? Did Hector? Here the honest answer is the simplest. There is not a shred of evidence for any individual named in the poem, and there is unlikely ever to be any. They are literary figures. They may be built on the memory of real warlords whose names drifted through the tradition, or they may be inventions of the singers, and no method now available can tell the difference. Which leaves this as the verdict, and it is the one most serious scholars would sign, with local variations of emphasis. There was a real city in a real strategic position that suffered a real and violent destruction at approximately the traditional time, in a region where Greek-speaking raiders and Anatolian powers really did come into conflict over that very place. Around that core, across 5 centuries of oral transmission, through an age that had lost its writing, a tradition of extraordinary richness accumulated, preserving fragments of genuine Bronze Age reality with startling fidelity while inventing, magnifying, and reshaping everything else into the greatest war story ever told. Troy is neither history nor fiction. It is a memory, partly true, partly made, and now inseparable. And it may help to say what that verdict is not. It is not a fudge, and it is not a refusal to answer. It is the answer, and it is more precise than either of the two positions people usually want. The maximalist claim that the Iliad is essentially a historical account of a real 10-year war fought by the named heroes is dead and has been for a long time, and no serious scholar defends it. The minimalist claim that the whole thing is invention and the site's identification with the poem is an accident of enthusiasm has been steadily losing ground for 40 years because the lower town is real, and Wailusa is real, and Alexandru is real, and the destruction layer is real, and the coincidences have piled up past the point where dismissing them is the sober position. What is left standing in the middle is not vagueness. It is a specific, evidenced, and quite remarkable claim that a poem sung by illiterate men for 5 centuries preserved the location, the name, the approximate date, and the violent end of a real Bronze Age city, along with authentic details of its material world, wrapped inside a narrative that is almost entirely fiction. And there is something worth sitting with in that answer, rather than being disappointed by it. We wanted a verdict and we got a texture. But the texture is more interesting than any verdict would have been, because it tells us something true about how human beings hold on to the past. Nothing survives intact. Everything that comes down to us across a great gap of time comes down changed, dressed in the assumptions of whoever carried it, magnified where it moved people and forgotten where it did not. That is not a flaw in the tradition. That is what a tradition is. The Iliad is what memory looks like after 3,000 years. And the fact that anything at all crossed those centuries, that a boar's tusk helmet and a royal name and a city on a strait made it through 500 years of silence in the mouths of singers who could not write, is a genuine wonder and a better ending than a certainty would have been. The weighing is done. Before we follow the story out of the Bronze Age and into the 3,000 years that came after, the night pauses one last time on the plain below the ruined hill under the stars. It is very late now over the coast of Anatolia. The city is long gone. Not just fallen, but gone. The walls slumped, the burnt beams rotted, the mud brick washing slowly back into the earth it came from, the whole great citadel settling year by year into the shape of a low hill with grass on it. Nothing moves up there. The plain below is dark and wide, the 2 rivers finding their way across it in the blackness, catching a little starlight where they bend. Out to the west and north, the sea is a deeper darkness with a faint sheen on it, and the strait runs between its shores like a road of dull silver. And overhead is the sky, which has not changed. The same constellations that wheeled over the ships drawn up on that beach are wheeling over the empty plain tonight. The ones the poem itself names, because Homer put them on the great shield his god-smith makes for Achilles, the Pleiades, the Hyades, the strength of Orion, and the bear, which the Greeks also called the wagon, turning always in its place and never bathing in the sea. 3,000 years of nights have passed since anyone stood on this plain and looked up at them with a spear in his hand, and they are exactly where they were. There is a great quiet in that, and a great rest. Everyone who was ever here is gone. The Trojans and the Greeks, the poets who sang them, the tourists of the classical world who came to see the tomb of Achilles, the workmen who swung picks for Schliemann in the summer heat, all of them, every one, gone into the same dark that covers the hill. What they made mostly did not last. The walls fell. The palaces went. The gold went into a museum, and then into a war, and then into another country. And the stars they navigated by, and swore by, and set on the shield of a hero, are still turning overhead exactly as they turned, indifferent and unhurried, and completely unchanged. Rest here a while, on the dark plain, under those old stars, before the last part of the story. Somewhere out on the flats a night bird is calling at intervals, and between the calls there is nothing at all. No engine, no voice, no sound, but the water moving in the channel and the faint dry rustle of the reeds when the air stirs. The two rivers wind out toward the sea in the dark, and where they meet the shallows, the water goes very quiet and holds the stars almost without moving them. The great mound is a shape against the sky, and nothing more. A slightly darker darkness with the rim of it just visible where the starlight catches the broken stone. Down where the beach was, the surf turns over slowly and drags back, and turns over again, and has been doing that without stopping for 3,000 years. There is nothing left up on the hill but grass and stone and the long silence after everything. The wind has dropped. The rivers are running quietly out to the strait, as they have every night for 3,000 years. And above the whole sleeping coast, the bear turns in its place and never bathes in the sea, exactly as a poet said it did, in a language nobody speaks anymore, about a war that may never have happened, on a plain that is empty tonight and full of stars. The war ended, if it happened, around 1180 BC. What follows is the strangest part of Troy's story, and in some ways the most important. The city fell, and then refused to stay dead, and went on shaping the world for 3,000 years as an idea. The ruin sat on its hill for centuries, and Greeks eventually came back to it. By the classical age, there was a Greek town on the mound. Ilion, they called it, keeping the old name, and it made its living in a way that will sound entirely familiar. It was a pilgrimage site. Visitors came to see the place from the poem. There was a temple of Athena where you could make an offering, and local guides who would show you the tomb of Achilles and the tomb of Patroclus out on the plain, and no doubt sell you something. The tourists of the ancient world went to Troy for exactly the reason tourists go anywhere, because they had read the book. And in 334 BC, the most famous tourist in history arrived. Alexander of Macedon, 22 years old, had just crossed the Hellespont at the head of the army with which he intended to conquer the Persian Empire, and the first thing he did on Asian soil was go to Troy. He sacrificed at the temple. He took, the sources say, a shield from the sanctuary that was said to have hung there since the Trojan War, and carried it with him on campaign as a talisman. And he went out onto the plain to the mound identified as the tomb of Achilles, and anointed it with oil, and ran a race around it naked with his companions in the old heroic manner, and laid a wreath on it, while his closest friend Hephaestion laid a wreath on the tomb said to be Patroclus's, which told everyone watching precisely how Alexander understood his own life. He is reported to have said that he envied Achilles for having had a Homer to make him immortal. And the whole of his subsequent career reads like a man determined to solve that problem for himself. He carried historians and poets with him. He arranged his own image with enormous care. And when his own dearest companion Hephaestion died at Ecbatana years later, in the middle of Asia, Alexander's grief was so extravagant, refusing food, cutting his hair, ordering a funeral pyre of monstrous expense, and reportedly having the mourning extended across the empire, that ancient writers explicitly compared it to Achilles over Patroclus, and it is impossible to read the episode without feeling that Alexander himself intended the comparison. He had chosen his story at 22 on that plain, and he played it out to the end, dying at 32, young and undefeated and famous forever, exactly as the poem specified. He was not the last conqueror to make that pilgrimage. Xerxes, marching west with the Persian army a century and a half earlier, had stopped at Troy and sacrificed 1,000 cattle there, presenting his invasion of Greece as revenge for the ancient Greek assault on Asia. The same story, read from the other side, used as a war justification. Roman generals visited. The Emperor Caracalla, centuries later, staged his own Achilles performance at the site, complete with funeral games for a dead favorite. For 1,000 years, powerful men on their way to war went out of their way to stand on that hill and be photographed in the imagination of their contemporaries next to a character from a poem. That episode tells you more about the afterlife of the poem than any literary analysis could. Alexander slept, the tradition says, with a copy of the Iliad under his pillow, annotated by his old tutor Aristotle. He was not visiting a historical site. He was stepping into a story, deliberately, and casting himself in it. And the conquest that followed. The campaign that carried Greek culture from Egypt to the borders of India and reshaped the ancient world. was conducted by a man who had explicitly modeled himself on a character from a 900-year-old poem about a war on that coast. Whether or not Achilles ever lived, he changed history. The Greeks made Troy a shrine. The Romans did something far more audacious. They made it their ancestor. The claim goes like this: when the city fell, not everyone died. A prince of the royal house named Aeneas, a real figure in the Iliad, a secondary but respected Trojan warrior, escaped the burning city carrying his aged father on his back and leading his young son by the hand, gathered survivors, and sailed west. After long wanderings, he came to Italy, fought and married into the local peoples, and founded the line from which, centuries later, Romulus would come and build Rome. So the Romans were not merely admirers of the Trojan story. They were, by their own account, Trojans. Refugees from that burning city come west to build something greater on the ruins of their defeat. It is a magnificent piece of national myth-making, and it did several jobs at once. It gave Rome a heroic ancestry as old and dignified as anything the Greeks could claim, which mattered enormously to a culture that felt culturally junior to the Greek world it had conquered. It made Rome's rise a kind of cosmic restitution, the losers of the Great War eventually inheriting the earth, and it let Roman aristocratic families trace their bloodlines into the poem. The Julii, the family of Julius Caesar and Augustus, claimed descent from Aeneas's son, and therefore from Aeneas's mother, who was the goddess of love herself. Augustus understood the value of that, and commissioned the poem that fixed it forever. Virgil's Aeneid, written in the 1st century BC, is the Iliad's answer and its heir. The story of the Trojan survivor, his flight from the burning city, his wanderings, his doomed love affair in Carthage, his descent to the underworld to see the future of his line, and his war in Italy to found the race that would rule the world. It gave us the most famous account of the fall of Troy: the horse, the priest, and the serpents, the night of fire. And it gave the Roman Empire a founding scripture. For 1500 years afterward, through the Middle Ages, when Homer himself was largely unread in Western Europe because almost nobody could read Greek, it was Virgil's Latin that carried Troy. Medieval Europe knew the story through Rome's version, and the fashion for Trojan ancestry spread. The Franks claimed it, the Britons claimed it, half the royal houses of Europe traced imaginary lines back to that burning city on the Anatolian coast, because there was no more prestigious place in the world to come from. A city that may have been sacked by raiders over a trade route thus became, in the imagination of the West, the origin of everything. The defeated became the ancestors. It is the most successful afterlife any ruin has ever had, and the claim kept spreading long after Rome fell. Medieval chroniclers in France traced the Franks to a Trojan prince named Francus. In Britain, a 12th century writer produced a history in which the island was settled by Brutus, a great-grandson of Aeneas, who gave his name to Britain, a story taken seriously enough that it shaped English royal propaganda for centuries and turns up in Shakespeare's sources. The Venetians claimed Trojan descent. The Turks, in a neat inversion, were at various points said by European writers to descend from the Trojans too, which made the Ottoman capture of Constantinople a belated revenge on the Greeks. An argument reportedly made by Mehmed the Conqueror himself when he visited the site of Troy after taking the city. Everybody wanted to be Trojan. The losers of the oldest war in Western memory became the most sought-after ancestors in Europe because defeat with dignity, followed by exile and refounding, is a far better story to build a nation on than simply having always been there. Consider what had to happen for the Iliad to reach you. It had to survive 5 centuries of illiteracy in the mouths of singers. And before that, it had to survive the destruction of the world it described, which is a subtler point but an important one. The Mycenaean palace states did not merely fall. They were replaced by a way of life so different that the memory of them became unintelligible. The people who kept singing about kings with fleets and bronze armor and gold cups were living in villages, farming small plots, and burying their dead with almost nothing. The gap between the world of the song and the world of the singer was enormous, and it kept widening for 400 years, and the tradition carried on anyway, transmitting descriptions of a wealth and organization that nobody in the audience had ever seen. That is one reason we can be confident real Bronze Age material is embedded in the poems. The singers had no way to invent a world that grand, because nothing around them resembled it. Then, At some point around 700 BC, in a Greek world newly equipped with an alphabet borrowed from Phoenician traders, it had to be written down. An enormous undertaking, thousands of lines, on materials that were expensive and perishable for reasons nobody fully understands, since the culture that produced it had gotten along perfectly well with it unwritten. Then the text had to be copied, by hand, generation after generation, each copy an opportunity for error, for 1500 years before anything like printing existed. It had to survive the collapse of the Greek world into Roman rule, the collapse of Rome, and the near-total loss of Greek learning in Western Europe, where for centuries the poem existed only as a rumour and a name while Virgil carried the story instead. It survived because Byzantine scholars in Constantinople kept copying it, because Islamic and later European scholars valued the classical inheritance, because monks and copyists and librarians in various centuries made the specific decision that these particular sheets were worth the labour of reproduction. Then, when Constantinople fell in 1453 and Greek scholars fled west with their manuscripts, it arrived in Renaissance Italy and detonated. The oldest complete manuscript of the Iliad we possess was copied out in Byzantium in the 10th century AD, 1,000 years after Virgil, 2,000 after the events it describes, and it survives today in a library in Venice. That single book is a hinge in the history of literature. It carries not only the poem, but ancient scholarly annotations in its margins, notes copied from notes going back to the librarians of Alexandria, who had themselves been comparing manuscripts and arguing about variant readings 600 years before it was written. When modern scholars edit Homer, they are working with a chain of custody that runs through those margins. Somebody in Alexandria in the 2nd century BC wondered whether a particular line was genuine and wrote it down, and a Byzantine scribe copied the note, and it is still on the page. Every step of that chain could have failed, and for most works of ancient literature, every step did. We know the names of dozens of epic poems from the Trojan cycle. The ones that told the judgment of Paris, the gathering of the fleet, the death of Achilles, the wooden horse, the sack. And we have almost none of them. They exist as titles, summaries, and scattered quotations in later authors. The stories survived. The poems did not. Of the vast body of song that once surrounded Troy, 2 poems came through whole, and both are attributed to Homer, and they are the 2 that people apparently could not bear to lose. And once printing arrived, the thing became unstoppable. Translated into every European language, taught in every school that taught anything, imitated, argued over, rewritten, resented, and returned to. Every generation makes it new. It has been read as a celebration of martial glory and as one of the great anti-war poems, as a story about honor and as a story about grief, as the foundation of Western literature and as an uncomfortable inheritance. Poets have carried it. Dante placed Homer among the noble spirits. Shakespeare took the material and soured it. Keats wrote a sonnet about the shock of reading it in translation. It has been filmed, reworked as novels from Briseis's point of view and Achilles's, taught to teenagers who have never heard of the Bronze Age, and quoted by people who have no idea they are quoting it. 3,000 years is a long time for anything human to last. The empires that ruled that coastline in the interval, Hittite, Persian, Macedonian, Roman, Byzantine, Ottoman, have all come and gone. The poem is still here, still being read tonight in 100 languages, about a city that a poet may have invented, and that turned out, against every expectation, to be real. But why this one? Thousands of wars have been fought and forgotten. Why did this particular tale, out of everything the Bronze Age might have left us, become the story that would not die? It is not the fighting. There is a great deal of combat in the Iliad, and it is described with a technical precision that can become numbing, and it is not what anyone remembers. What people remember, and what has kept the poem alive through every change in human taste and belief, is something else entirely. It is the most honest poem about loss that anyone has ever written, and it refuses, from beginning to end, to make death mean anything comforting. Look at how it treats its own heroes. Achilles is the greatest warrior in the world, and the poem lets him say, out loud, in front of the whole embassy, that none of it is worth dying for. That the same fate comes to the coward and the brave man, that cattle and tripods can be won back, but a man's life cannot, and that he could go home and live a long, quiet life instead. He then chooses to die anyway, not for honor, but for grief, to avenge a friend. And the poem shows that this brings him no peace whatsoever. His vengeance is complete, and he is not healed. That is a devastatingly unsentimental thing for a heroic poem to say about heroism. Look at how it treats the enemy. Hector is the finest human being in the story, and he is on the losing side, and the poem knows it and grieves for him. His scene with his wife and small son on the walls, the child frightened by the plume on his father's helmet, the father laughing and taking it off, the prayer that his boy might one day be called better than his father, the wife who knows exactly what is coming and says so, is the most quoted passage in the poem, and it belongs to the people who are going to lose everything. A warrior culture produced a war epic in which the audience's sympathy is deliberately given to the defenders of the city their ancestors sacked. And look at how it ends. Not with the horse, not with the victory, not with the burning, which would have been the natural climax and which the traditions certainly contained. Homer stops before all of it. He ends with two men who have every reason to hate each other sitting together in a shelter at night, weeping, one for his son and one for his friend, and then eating a meal and looking at each other and marveling at each other's beauty and courage. The old king who has kissed the hands of the man who killed his son. The young man who knows he has weeks to live. The most famous war story in the world ends with the enemy being given his son's body back and a truce for the funeral, and nothing resolved. That is why it lasted. Not because it glorifies anything, but because 3,000 years ago, in a culture built on raiding and honor and violence, somebody looked steadily at what war actually does to people on both sides and set it down without flinching and without lying. And every generation since, arriving at that final book, has recognized something true. For all the poem and all the argument, it is worth coming back down to the ground and remembering that whatever happened at Troy happened to ordinary people, whose names we will never know, and who did not think of themselves as living inside a story. There was a woman in that city who worked wool. We know this not from the poem, but from the ground. The excavations have produced spindle halls in extraordinary numbers, thousands of them. The small weighted discs used to spin thread by hand. Somebody used every one of those. Textile production on that scale was women's work in that world, and it means that a great part of the daily life of Troy, a great part of its wealth, probably, consisted of women sitting and spinning and weaving, hour after hour, year after year, making the cloth that the city traded. She was as real as you are. There was a man who kept horses, because the bones are there in quantity, and because the tradition never stopped calling the Trojans tamers of horses, and that epithet, carried down 500 years of song, is the kind of detail that turns out to be true. He knew the plain where they grazed, and the price of a good animal, and which of the local families bred the best stock. There was a harbour official, or whatever they called such a person, who dealt with the ships that piled up in the bay waiting for the wind, who knew how many days a captain from Cyprus had been sitting there, and what he was carrying, and what the city's cut would be. There were guards on the walls who were bored most nights. There were children who ran in the streets of the lower town. There were people who had come from elsewhere and settled, as there always are in a trading city, speaking with an accent the locals noticed. And then, in the last phase, there were people who moved inside the walls because it was no longer safe outside, and who partitioned their houses to make room for relatives from the countryside, and who sank great jars into their floors and filled them with grain against a siege they hoped would not come. Somebody dug those holes. Somebody decided how much barley to bury and how long it might have to last. That is a completely ordinary human act performed under an extraordinary weight of fear. And it is one of the few things about the fall of Troy that we can say with real confidence actually happened, because the jars are there. And there is one more category of person worth naming, because the tradition is unusually clear about them and the archaeology is silent. In the poem, and in the Greek tragedies that came after, the fate of a captured city falls hardest on its women, who are not killed but taken, inventoried with the rest of the plunder, allotted to the captains, carried across the sea, and set to work in the households of the men who destroyed their families. The Iliad opens on a quarrel over exactly such a woman, and treats her as a prize. Euripides, 500 years later, gave those same women the stage and let them speak. Whether or not a Greek army ever did this at Troy, this is what happened to real cities in that world. routinely, and the women of 100 smaller places whose names the poets never bothered to record went into slavery without an Iliad to remember them by. When the tradition mourns Troy, it is mourning, without quite knowing it, all the towns that fell in that age and left nothing at all. They were us. Not characters, not symbols, not the furniture of a poem. People with the same fears and affections and small daily calculations as anyone listening tonight, living at the end of an age they did not know was ending, in a city they assumed would go on. When the story speaks of Troy, it means Priam and Hector and Helen. When the ground speaks of Troy, it means the woman with the spindle and the man with the storage jar, and the ground, in this case, is the more reliable witness. Go there now, and this is what you find. The site is open to visitors, a protected archaeological park on the Turkish coast, a short drive from the modern town of Çanakkale, near the mouth of the Dardanelles. There is a visitor centre and a museum, because the human impulse to give people what they came for is eternal. A large wooden horse standing near the entrance, which everyone photographs and which no archaeologist takes seriously. Beyond it is the mound, and the mound is confusing, which is the honest truth about it. It is also smaller than most visitors expect, and the disappointment is worth naming honestly, because everyone feels it. People come with the poem in their heads, the topless towers, the 10-year siege, the plain black with armies, and they find a fenced archaeological park you can walk around in an hour with signposts and a wooden walkway and a great deal of scrub. The mind refuses, at first, to fit the story into the space. And then something adjusts, and the smallness becomes the point. This is what a Bronze Age city actually was, and this is the real scale of the ancient world, and the poem has been inflating it in your imagination since childhood. Everything human happens on a smaller stage than the stories suggest. The same adjustment happens at every great site. Mycenae, from which the fleet supposedly sailed, is a compact citadel you can cross in a few minutes. The Palace of Pylos is a footprint of low walls. The Bronze Age kingdoms that loom so large in the poems were, in modern terms, small towns with a fortified big house on the hill and a few thousand people in the countryside around. And knowing that does not diminish them. It does the opposite. Everything those societies achieved, the gold work, the engineering, the trade reaching Egypt and the Baltic, the poems that outlived them by 3 millennia, was achieved by populations the size of a modern village, without machines, in a world where a bad harvest was a mortal threat. The scale makes the achievement larger, not smaller. 9 cities layered and cut into by a century and a half of excavation do not produce a tidy ruin. There are stretches of the great sloping wall of Troy VI, and they are genuinely impressive, beautifully fitted limestone, still standing to a good height, curving away with that distinctive inward lean. There is a gate and a paved ramp, and the outlines of houses on their terraces. There is the enormous gash of Schliemann's trench, which is now itself a monument, to what he found and to what he destroyed. Signposts try to explain which wall belongs to which millennium, and visitors stand in front of them working it out, or not. And then you walk to the edge of the citadel and look out, and the confusion falls away, because the landscape does what the ruins cannot. The plain spreads out below, flat and green and wide, with the 2 rivers threading across it. Beyond it lies the sea. To the north the land narrows, and there is the strait, blue and busy, with modern freighters standing up it. Still, 3,000 years later, the only sea road to the Black Sea, still carrying the grain of the north, still exactly the bottleneck it always was. Ships still wait for weather in that channel, and the plain below is farmland now, worked as it has been continuously for millennia. Cotton and sunflowers and grain in the flat fields where the poem puts the armies, tractors going up and down where the ships were beached, and in the spring the whole floodplain green and unremarkable and entirely ordinary, which is its own kind of answer to everything. Stand there long enough and you will see the traffic. Bulk carriers and tankers and container ships in a slow procession, hundreds of them a day, threading the same channel under the same wind. It is one of the busiest and most strategically sensitive waterways on Earth, governed by an international convention, watched constantly and fought over diplomatically in every generation. The reason has not changed since the Bronze Age. There is no other way through. And if you stand on the citadel at the right hour, you can watch a container ship the length of 3 football pitches slide past the mouth of the strait, and think about the fact that its captain is making the same calculation about wind and current that a Bronze Age merchant made from the same water, and that the city under your feet was built on that calculation, and that everything else, the poem, the heroes, the 3,000 years of argument, grew out of the simple physical fact that ships have to go through there and sometimes cannot. On the far shore is the Gallipoli Peninsula, where, in 1915, another army came by sea to that same strait and could not take it, and where the dead of a much more recent war lie in cemeteries within sight of the plain where the oldest war in Western memory was supposed to have been fought. Nobody who stands on that hill fails to notice that. The ruins alone might disappoint. The position never does. Stand up there in the late afternoon with the wind coming off the water, and the whole thing becomes obvious. Why a city was built precisely there, why it was rich, why people came for it, why it was worth walls like that. The poem tells you a war was fought here over a woman. The landscape tells you it was fought over the strait. You can see both from the same spot. The city fell, and its language died, and its people scattered. And yet the story left deposits in everyday speech that are still in circulation 3,000 years later, used daily by people who have never read a line of Homer. A Trojan horse is a gift that carries the enemy inside it. The phrase has been in every European language for centuries and was borrowed, in the 20th, by computer security, so that the most common name for a category of malicious software is a reference to a wooden statue in a Bronze Age poem. An Achilles' heel is a single fatal vulnerability in something otherwise invincible. The tendon at the back of the human ankle is named for a hero's death. To face a Herculean task, to make an odyssey of a journey, to describe a beautiful woman as the face that launched 1,000 ships, to call an argument a bone of contention or a prize an apple of discord. The story is threaded through ordinary language like wire through cloth. It runs deeper than idiom. The Iliad and the Odyssey stand at the head of the Western literary tradition, and nearly everything downstream is shaped by them. The idea of an epic, the tragic hero, the wandering home narrative, the war story that questions its own war. Greek tragedy took its material from the Trojan cycle again and again. Virgil built Rome's national poem on it. Dante and Chaucer and Shakespeare worked with it. Joyce structured a modern novel on the Odyssey. Every story about a soldier who cannot go home, every reluctant warrior, every siege told from both sides, sits somewhere in that shadow. And there is the peculiar afterlife of the place itself. Because of the poem, a low hill in northwestern Turkey has been visited by Xerxes, by Alexander, by Roman emperors, by Ottoman travelers, by Victorian gentlemen with copies of Homer, and by millions of ordinary tourists. A continuous stream of pilgrimage lasting well over 2,000 years, all of it caused by a work of literature. There are few clearer demonstrations of what stories do in the world. The bronze of the Bronze Age is gone. The kingdoms are gone. The words are still here, and they still send people to that hill, and they still shape how people see wars that have nothing to do with the Aegean. Commanders and journalists reach for the vocabulary constantly. A modern siege becomes a Troy. A stubborn defender becomes a Hector. A fatal weakness in a superpower becomes an Achilles' heel. Soldiers have carried translations of the Iliad through 20th century wars and written about recognizing themselves in it. A well-known study by an American psychiatrist used the poem as a framework for understanding combat trauma in Vietnam veterans, arguing that what Homer describes when Achilles loses his friend and goes berserk is a clinically recognizable thing that happens to people in war and has always happened. The poem keeps being useful in that way, which is not what art is for, and is nonetheless what this particular work has been doing continuously for 3,000 years. At the very beginning of tonight, a question was set down and left standing, and it is time to come back to it. The deepest mystery of Troy is not whether the city fell. Cities fall constantly. The ancient world is a graveyard of them, and most went down without leaving so much as a name. The real mystery is how the memory of this one survived when everything around it was lost. Think about what was destroyed in that collapse. The palaces of Mycenae and Pylos and Tiryns burned. The Hittite Empire disintegrated and its capital was abandoned. Trade stopped. Populations fell, in some regions catastrophically. Writing was lost in Greece so completely that the very existence of the earlier script was forgotten until it was excavated in the 20th century and deciphered in the 1950s. Whole kingdoms, whole dynasties, whole languages went into the dark. The people living in Greece 300 years after the collapse had no records of the Bronze Age at all, could not read the tablets buried under their feet, and looked at the colossal walls of the ruined citadels around them and concluded that giants must have built them because no memory remained of the people who actually had. And through 4 or 5 centuries of poverty and illiteracy and forgetting, a story about a city on the far side of the Aegean came down intact enough that when someone finally dug where the story said to dig, there was a city there. Not because of records, because there were none. Not because of monuments, because they had fallen. Because people kept singing it. Because in villages and halls through the dark centuries, someone at the end of a meal picked up an instrument and began the lines again, and someone younger listened closely enough to carry them on, and that happened, uninterrupted, for perhaps 15 generations. The chain never broke. If it had broken once, one generation with no one listening, one region where the singers stopped, we would have nothing. And it is worth being clear about how nearly it did break. The dark centuries were not a pause. They were a demographic and cultural catastrophe. Settlements shrank to villages. Population, on the best estimates, fell dramatically across the Greek mainland. Long-distance trade nearly ceased. The fine goods stopped arriving. Craft skills were lost, including, in some regions, the ability to make certain kinds of pottery that had been ordinary 2 generations earlier. People stopped building in stone. Whole districts were abandoned. In conditions like that, a tradition is carried not by institutions. There were none, but by individuals, by whoever, in a poor village in a bad century, still knew the lines and still had somebody willing to sit and listen after the meal. That is an unbelievably thin thread on which to hang the foundation of Western literature, and it held. That is what a tradition is, and it is the most fragile and most durable thing human beings make. Fragile, because it lives only in memory and dies the moment it stops being passed on. Durable, because when it is passed on, it can outlast writing, empires, cities, and the language it started in. And the same fragility runs through everything else that reached us from the ancient world. The great library at Alexandria is gone. Most Greek tragedy is gone. We have a handful of plays by 3 playwrights out of the hundreds written by dozens. The other poems of the Trojan cycle are gone, surviving as titles and summaries. Whole authors exist now only as names in other people's footnotes. What we call the classical inheritance is not the literature of the ancient world. It is the small fraction of it that happened to be copied often enough, by enough people, in enough places, to get through every bottleneck between then and now. And the bottlenecks were brutal. Every text that reached the present did so by being valued continuously in every single generation for 2,000 years and more. Break that chain once, and the book is gone forever, and thousands of them were. Everything solid that the Bronze Age built is gone or in fragments. The song is still here. And it is worth noticing what kind of thing survived and what kind did not, because the lesson is not obvious. The palaces had walls of cyclopean stone. They are ruins. The empires had armies, treasuries, chariots, and archives. They are gone, and the archives survive only because a fire baked the clay by accident. The gold went into the ground. What crossed the gap was the least material thing anyone made, a pattern of sound, carried in the memory of poor men in a poor age, weighing nothing, costing nothing, requiring no institution to maintain it beyond a room and an audience and a willingness to listen. Of all the things the Bronze Age had, the one that proved indestructible was the one that could not be stolen, burned, or carried off, because it existed only in people's heads, and there were always more heads. There is a lesson in that which the people of the first cities could not have drawn, and which we are perhaps only now in a position to see. Everything a civilization builds in stone and metal is hostage to fortune. It can be sacked, melted, quarried for someone else's wall, or simply left to the weather. What survives is what gets carried forward deliberately by people who choose to carry it, generation after generation. Culture is not a possession, it is a relay, and you are at the end of that chain tonight. Consider what that chain actually consists of, laid out end to end. Somebody saw something, or heard about it, on that coast in the 12th century BC. Somebody made a song. Singers carried it through 400 years in which nothing could be written down. Somebody dictated or composed a version that was written around 700 BC in a brand new alphabet borrowed from Phoenician merchants. Scribes copied it. Scholars in Alexandria compared copies and argued about lines. Romans read it and built an empire's self-image partly on its sequel. Byzantine monks copied it again through centuries when Western Europe could not read a word of Greek. Scholars fleeing a falling city carried manuscripts to Italy. Printers set it in type. Translators put it into 100 languages. Teachers assigned it. And tonight it reaches a room somewhere with the lights off. Every one of those handoffs was a choice made by a person who thought it was worth the trouble. The line runs from someone standing on that plain, to someone who told it, to the singers of the dark centuries, to Homer, to the scribes and the copyists and the librarians of Alexandria and Byzantium, to a Renaissance printing house, to a schoolroom, to a translation, to a voice in the dark telling it again, to you, lying in a room 3,000 years and half a world away, listening. The people who first told this story could not have imagined you. They told it anyway, and it reached you. And that is worth holding for a moment, because it is the closest thing to immortality that human beings have actually achieved, not the kind Achilles was promised. The gods did not preserve him, and there is no shining afterlife in that poem. Only a grey diminishment he explicitly says is worse than the meanest life. What preserved him was a sequence of ordinary people deciding, one after another for 100 generations, that the story was worth another telling. The mechanism of his deathless fame turns out to be entirely human and entirely fragile. It is other people remembering and choosing to pass it on. That is all it has ever been. And it worked. Whatever else Troy is, it is proof that a thing carried carefully enough can cross almost any amount of dark. So what, in the end, is Troy? It is a real hill on a real coast, with 9 cities inside it and the marks of fire in its layers. It is a poem of 15,000 lines about 7 weeks of a war that may never have happened. It is a name in a Hittite treaty. It is a heap of gold in a Moscow museum with a disputed history. It is the reason Alexander crossed the Hellespont with a wreath in his hand, and the reason Rome believed it descended from refugees, and the reason a piece of malicious software is called a horse. It is a plain where the wind still comes off the water in the evening, and a strait where ships still wait for weather. And it is, above all, a story about the fact that everything ends, which is perhaps the honest reason it has outlasted everything else. The Iliad never pretends its heroes will be saved. It tells you, repeatedly and in advance, that Achilles will die, that Troy will burn, that Hector's small son will not grow up in the city his father is defending. The characters know it too. They say so. And they go on doing what they do anyway. Fighting, arguing, loving their friends, burying their dead with the proper rites, being kind at the very end to the enemy who has taken everything from them. The poem's answer to mortality is not consolation. It is conduct. This is what it costs, and this is how you might bear it. And it grounds that answer in a single image that recurs through the whole work and is easy to miss: the funeral. The Iliad is full of them. It ends with one. Its final line is not about victory or grief in the abstract, but about a specific rite properly performed. The burial of Hector, tamer of horses. In a poem where the gods are capricious and the afterlife is a grey diminishment that Achilles himself describes as worse than the meanest life on earth, the burning of the body and the raising of the mound and the naming of the dead is the one thing human beings can do that means something. It is what Achilles denies Hector in his rage, and what Priam crosses the plain at night to obtain, and what the poem's last page finally grants. 3,000 years later, on the same coastline, the cemeteries of Gallipoli sit in careful rows with the names cut into stone for exactly the same reason. It is the oldest human answer to death that we have, and the poem knew it was the only one available. The city on the hill did not survive. Neither did the empire that recorded its name, nor the kingdoms that may have burned it, nor the language it was burned in. What survived was the account of it. Imperfect, half-invented, carried in the mouths of people who could not write, arriving 3,000 years later in the hands of a species that has been to the moon and still reads it. Of everything the Bronze Age made, the most durable thing turned out to be a song about losing. There is one more thing to say, and it belongs at the end. The poem does not tell you what to conclude. It does not say war is glorious, and it does not say war is futile. It puts both in front of you and declines to arbitrate. Achilles gets the speech about how nothing is worth a life, and then goes out and kills anyway, and the poet does not editorialize. Hector is the better man and loses. Helen is guilty and blameless. The gods are magnificent and petty and settle nothing. Troy is destroyed, and the men who destroy it are destroyed on the way home, and a city that had done nothing but sit on a strait and grow rich is remembered forever for the night it burned. 3,000 years of readers have gone looking in that poem for a verdict on human violence and have come away instead with a description, which is, in the end, the more honest gift and probably the reason it has never gone out of date. And now our long night on the plain of Troy comes to its close, and it is time to set the whole of it down and let yourself sink towards sleep. There is nothing left to do. The story has been told, and the hill has been climbed, and the evidence has been weighed, and none of it needs carrying any further tonight. Let it all settle now, softly, the way ash settles over a burnt floor, the way silt settles in the slow bend of a river running out to the sea. Let it go. The golden apple and the hillside and the young man choosing wrongly, the black ships coming across the water, the long lines of them drawn up on the sand. Let it go. The 10 years, the quarrel in the camp, the walls that would not fall, the friend who went out in borrowed armor and did not come back. Let it drift away. The running around the walls, the old king kneeling in the shelter at midnight, the two of them weeping together and then eating a meal, the funeral and the truce and the last line of the poem. Let the horse stand empty on the plain and let the fire go out. You do not need to hold any of it. Let it settle and dim and sink down into the same deep quiet where all the ages have gone. Feel how far away it all is from you now, and how safe you are, here at the far end of that long, long thread. 3,000 years of nights have passed over that coast since the city burned. Everyone who was ever there has long since lain down, exactly as you are lying down now, and let the day go, and closed their eyes. The woman at her spinning, the man who buried the storage jars, the guards who were bored on the walls, the crews waiting on the beach for the wind, the singers who carried the story through the dark centuries, the boy who first heard it and grew old telling it. Every one of them slept, as you are about to sleep. The walls came down and the grass came over them. The gold went into the ground and came out again and went somewhere else. The plain is empty tonight and quiet, and it is all well. There is nothing you need to carry out of this night. No verdict to keep, no date to remember, no side to take in the long argument about what did or did not happen on that coast. It has been argued over for 3,000 years by people far more invested than either of us, and it will go on being argued over long after tonight, and none of it needs to be settled by you, now, in the dark, with your eyes closing. Let the question rest where it has always rested, out on the plain under the stars, unanswered and perfectly at peace. It is all as it should be. Everything that was built there passed in its time into the quiet, and was not lost, but only laid down to wait in the patient dark. Rest now, traveller. Let your body grow heavy and warm. Let the weight of the day, and the weight of those 3,000 years, settle and release. There is nothing to finish, nothing to solve, nothing to decide. The question of whether it happened can lie unanswered on the plain tonight along with everything else. It has waited this long and it will keep. The wind has dropped off the water. The rivers are running quietly out to the strait. And over the dark hill where the city stood, the old constellations are turning in their places. The wagon and the hunter and the bear that never bathes in the sea, exactly as a poet said they did, 3,000 years ago, in a song about a city that was only a story until somebody went and looked. Sleep now. The plain is dark and empty and at peace. The fires are long out, and the sea is quiet, and the last of the ships have gone up the strait and out of sight. The story is told. The night has come, soft and complete, over the hill and the plain and the water, over everyone who ever fought or waited or sang there, and over you. The city is asleep under its hill, as it has been for 3,000 years, and the plain is asleep, and the sea, and the long strait running north with the current, and all the countless people who ever stood on that shore and looked at the water and thought about going home. Let it carry you down, gently, into sleep. Sleep well, traveler. Good night.